Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Pylon Show. Oh, my God. Yeah, I'm finally back doing another Pylon Show. Big shout out to Cobra Venom. Please go ahead and spread the word that this is on, because this is going to be amazing. Today, we are talking about Stormgate, and specifically competitive design and esports design and the kinds of ideas that they have going into this. This is very much like, this is what I want to talk about. This is what I care about. And I mean, for people that watch me, I hope this is what you care about as well and that you enjoy this. Let me introduce our guests. First off, we have Monk. What's up? Can you introduce yourself for everybody, please?
Hi, my name is Monk. Before I worked at Frost Giant, I worked on co-op and balance in StarCraft 2. Before that, I worked on Team Liquid, and now I am a lead designer here at Frost Giant, working on Stormgate with a focus on gameplay. And also, can I just say how honored I am to be on the Pylon Show with not just one, but two GSL participants.
Yes, I know. We are fantastic, aren't we? Torch, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, that definitely brings me back. So I guess we'll start there. I was a competitive player for a little bit of time in a few different games, including StarCraft 2, very, very early on. But for the last 8 years or so, I've been working more behind the scenes of esports. I was also at Blizzard Entertainment for quite a while. Headed up Hearthstone esports globally for 3 years, and then shifted over to lead up everything in Overwatch esports that wasn't Overwatch League. So that was Overwatch World Cup, it was our collegiate programs, it was contenders, all of the third-party licensing process, and bringing a lot of those learnings over to Frost Giant to build a responsible program that we can still create some really cool things and hopefully build on the legacy of RTS esports.
Yeah, and actually, don't do yourself justice. He was in GSL, guys. So me and Torch put together are equal to one no regret. Have to do it.
Torch doesn't like this so much, but I share the clips of Torch playing in GSL all the time.
Hey, it's way better than my music video debut that was also in that same era. So
yes, I remember that very well. Also, this is old GSL days, guys. And actually, Torch even infiltrated GOM TV back in the day, and he was fantastic there. Definitely, Tasteless and I were very happy to have him around back in those days. So, these are some great guys to talk about some Stormgate with. I have a ton of questions, and we actually have a lot of user questions that we will cut to at the end, guys. Cobra Venom will put a link for you guys in the chat. If you want questions to ask them, you can go ahead and put them into the Discord channel or whatever, and I will make sure to cut, and we will try to go through all the questions there, at least the ones that they haven't already answered from me. Okay, so here we go. Let's just kind of dive into some of the big things that I want to know. And I know that you guys have, there's been like nonstop interviews. I haven't been able to watch everything. I've seen some clips, but I kind of want this to be a little bit of a standalone. So even though I know the answers to a few of these, I know how you're leaning on a few of these, I do want to kind of go through them and make this kind of an all-encompassing, this is what the competitive scene will likely look like. Obviously, we can't hold you to anything being said here. The game is not out or anything. But yeah, let's go ahead and jump right into it. The first and biggest thing for me being, like, I mean, RTS games are my life. I fucking love them. And I have big opinions on a lot of things, so forgive me. But the first thing that I need to ask about is heroes. Okay. What are your thoughts on heroes? And I'm talking mostly about the 1v1 competitive aspect of the game. I know that there's like a 3v3 that's being worked on as well, so I'd like to hear about that also. But like the main drive is like heroes, 1v1. Is this actually something that is going to occur?
Yeah, so our stance on heroes, we asked around, we polled the community, we polled a lot of content creators as well about their thoughts on heroes. Before I start, I want to preface this with everything I say. We're still in the prototype mode. We're still very early on, so this is all subject to change. The second thing is that we're experimenting with heroes in each of our modes on an individual level right now. That means the co-op side, the 3v3 PvP side, and the 1v1 PvP side. So currently in our prototypes, we do have heroes in each of the three modes. That being said, we won't necessarily have them in the final release of the game or even in beta or when we actually release the 1.0 version. Our stance on heroes is we took a lot of good feedback from heroes, and let me jump back before, is that I think when you're talking to a Blizzard RTS audience, I think there's a trap to fall into of StarCraft heroes and Warcraft heroes. In StarCraft, I would say generally there are no heroes, with maybe the exception of the Mothership Core and the Mothership, whereas in Warcraft, you kind of have like the most complicated depiction of heroes, full of leveling and items and itemization. And I think there's a wide spectrum in between there of what exactly a heroes is. So I don't want to trap ourselves into the thinking of a binary option of no heroes at all or fully fledged heroes. So where are we with heroes? When we polled the community, we got two major pieces of feedback in terms of how heroes were a negative experience. And those were the threat of over-centralization and the threat of snowballing. With regards to over-centralization, because heroes have these powerful abilities, these powerful auras, you tend to have these death ball scenarios where you're not encouraged to split off units on the other side of the map, like a medevac drop or a Zergling run by, for instance. I think a lot of this is caused by heroes in Warcraft 3. However, also a large part of it is that there's not really like a very strong harasser unit in Warcraft 3 that is like the Zergling or a Marine drop. So that's something to consider. The second thing to consider is the threat of snowballing. In Warcraft 3, what ends up happening is every time you kill one of your opponent's units, it's kind of permanently tracked on your hero. I will say in Warcraft 3, there are anti-snowball mechanics with regards to heroes as well. For example, killing an enemy hero, especially a high-level hero, is very impactful. The higher level the enemy hero is, the longer time it takes to revive, and the more it costs to revive. However, that being said, with regards to a lot of this is caused by leveling. Specifically, as heroes grow stronger over time, they become very powerful. They cost 5 supply, but in reality, in the late game, they're often like 30 or 40 supply units when they get to level 6 or 7, for example. So our approach with heroes right now in the current prototypes is that A, they don't level, and B, they don't have items. And what this allows us to do is we start you off with this singular unit early on that is not particularly lethal, first of all, and that helps you guide you throughout the entire game. And acts kind of as a singular unit, a special unit, as it were. Similar, I would say, to the Mothership Core, but with a few differences. I think when you take a look at the history of the Mothership Core, it's not a particularly well-liked unit. And my analysis of it personally is that it's not necessarily because it was a hero unit, but because of how lethal the Mothership Core was, or potentially lethal the Mothership Core was. One thing that a lot of people don't know about me is that I actually quit StarCraft 2 before I joined Blizzard because of the Mothership Core specifically. I was watching this game. It was a GSL game of innovation, and I can't remember who the Protoss was. It was a 4-player map. It was Frost, and what happened is, especially during that time, the metagame was really tempo based. You had to actually really kill the Protoss player early on, or players felt that way, much more so than in today's metagame. And there was this one game. That one game, you had innovation fly over 4 of his medevacs, and he flies into a pylon and he immediately turns around he flies into 4 pylons and a Mothership Core. The Mothership Core didn't do anything, but because he saw that Mothership Core, he turned around. He lost like 2 minutes of tempo, and eventually he lost the game because of that. And I just thought, oh man, like this one Mothership Core was this 2 supply unit was able to fend off this entire army. Just by itself, just the threat of the power of the Mothership Core. And I think that is an example of a hero type unit that is over-centralizing and that is unhealthy for the game. However, I think one cool thing about the Mothership Core is it's something that you can target. And I want to give the example of the Mothership Core and its recall ability versus what we have now with the Nexus. So with the Mothership Core, if you wanted to if you sent it out with your army, right, your opponent could focus fire the Mothership Core and would disable the recall. And if they didn't have the Mothership Core, there was no recall abilities. However, with the current iteration of Nexus recall on the Nexi, it's kind of this nebulous thing where your opponent could recall their units at any given time from anywhere on the map. And it feels like there's not really counterplay to that. You can't target a unit and stop that ability. It's just something that you have to deal with as the enemy player. So kind of a long rant on heroes, but maybe this, hopefully this gives you a good idea of where we are with our design with heroes right now.
Yeah, no, I think that was a really well thought out answer there. And actually, I get a little bit nervous sometimes when I see how much you guys listen to the community, but it sounds like they actually gave very good feedback there, like the importance of like the kind of like death balling, for lack of a better word, that heroes cause, because that's definitely something that we've seen. It's like you don't split armies in hero based RTS games very much, and that's like the best thing about RTS is, you know, this is a huge part of RTS that other games don't have. You look at like every esport, this is the one where your screen actually jumps around to different locations all the time. And Heroes, I think, minimize that a lot, which actually takes so much of the excitement out of RTS. So I'm really glad to hear that. And if you do put in Heroes, maybe they won't have leveling or something like that. Just as a kind of like personal idea / opinion, I think the co-op and 3v3, like Heroes could be amazing in those types of things, right? Because you actually just automatically are going to have armies splitting up. You have 6 players in a game. Obviously, it's not 3 armies. There's 3 armies every time. That doesn't even make sense. But in a 1 versus 1, like I like the idea that you're keeping it open, that you could maybe put it in the 3v3, but not in the 1v1. So that's I like your answer there for sure. And I guess you say like the hero unit, if you were to have it, it could like help guide you through the game, like that type of idea. Because I knew you were gonna like kind of bring up the mothership core, but like, is there really a point? Like, isn't the reason people like to have heroes in games is that they have something to kind of focus on, and it gets more powerful, and people love building up like experience and getting a more powerful unit? Does the hero itself make the gameplay better if it's not actually scratching that raising itch for the player?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that's, with our design of heroes, that's actually, in my mind, the number one challenge. How do we balance the idea that these heroes are not over-centralizing with the idea that they gain power and they feel heroic and they feel like a hero over time? So some things that we're thinking about are things that are, I mentioned before, not lethal. This hero doesn't feel like it's doing most of the work, but for example, maybe they have buffs to support your actual units. Other ideas are abilities that are not necessarily focused on combat. Think about it this way. If there were no queens for Zerg, but you had kind of like a super queen that transfused, that creep spread, that injected, I forgot about the third ability for a while. But I think if that were the case, I think that actually solves a lot of problems that we have with mass queens in the StarCraft metagame right now, in that you can just build 1 million queens and you can build 1 million tumors, and you can inject all the time, and there's not really a lot of energy tension there. There's not really a lot of decision making because you can just choose to do everything at once, and it's never the wrong choice, as we can see right now.
Yeah. A very good point, actually. Because you brought up the queen and creep spreading and things like that, this is kind of like a much more general question, but are there things that you look at, right? Like, because it feels like RTS games in general that are trying to do really well are inspired by Warcraft 3, StarCraft 1, StarCraft 2, that kind of trifecta, even though there are other great games like Age of Empires out there. But I think obviously with you guys all being very focused on, you're Blizzard people basically, right? Like these are games that you guys played a lot. It's going to be somewhat focused on that. I wonder if there are things that you look at from those games that you specifically are going to avoid making that mistake again. Because honestly, like I think all 3 games have things that are, I'm like, ooh, let's just not do this in an RTS again. For instance, creep with queens, like that. I think that's one of the major things that is kind of screwed up. Why do we have so many Zerg champions? Well, creep is pretty good. Are there any things that you look at that you're like, okay, let's try to avoid making this type of situation again?
That is such an open-ended question, Dan. Let me start off by saying First of all, it's true that we take a lot of inspiration from Blizzard RTS games, and I would say like the core of our design philosophies are around our Blizzard RTS games. But we're also looking at other RTS games, like you mentioned. For example, Company of Heroes is a game that we're looking at, and what we like really about that is the idea of territory control. I would say if we had one gameplay tenet, one design pillar that we have, it's the idea that territory control is really important in our game. We think this is really cool, and we think it's like kind of the core tenet of what an RTS should be, because the idea of expanding and taking more territory in order to open up yourself to more resources, for instance, or more power versus opening yourself up to the risk of being attacked from multiple angles is really core to what an RTS is. From the Age of Empires franchise, we're looking at the ability to mine resources in different ways, the ability for different factions to have different strengths and weaknesses in that department. And another one that we're looking at is They Are Billions, where it's a single player game, but I think what's really cool about that is it really emphasizes the idea of base building, something that is not as prevalent in a game as StarCraft, the StarCraft franchise, for instance. So not only are we looking for like mistakes, I would say we're more looking for opportunities in a wide area of games. So with regards to like things that we would not want to do, like there are so many things, and I think I've read some of the questions that that will be coming up in community discussion, and I think we can talk more about that there.
Okay. No, that's a good answer to my very open-ended question, trying to get you to be negative. Okay. Well, you kind of mentioned about economy there a little bit in different ways that you can touch upon the economy. And obviously there's like a lot of different ways to do economy in RTS. You have like Age of Empires is like there's so many different economic things that can be going on, and at different times in the game you want different types of resources more, and that one's like super complex. And then you can go all the way down to Warcraft 3 where it's like, okay, this is simple. You got like 6 guys mining and then like exactly how many you need on trees, and it's very straightforward there. Then you have like StarCraft 2, which is much more complex than that, but it's got 2 resources, but like pretty much exactly what you want per patch. And then you have StarCraft 1, right, where it's like the economy is definitely more complex than StarCraft 2, but it's not quite Age of Empires level. With the way that StarCraft 2 workers mine, it's like diminishing returns, and more workers is always better, and spreading it upon additional patches actually means a lot more than it does in StarCraft 2, where 2 per patch is basically perfect. So I wonder what are you looking at economy wise? Like, where do you want to land on that spectrum? Are you taking more from one or another? It sounds like you even have the Age of Empires ideas in your head maybe a little bit, and I mean obviously there's other RTS games where different races might even mine different things. So what are you thinking about economy wise here?
Yeah, so in terms of economy, currently we have 2 types of resources in our game, and we're taking a lot of inspiration from a lot of games, but primarily the StarCraft and Warcraft franchises. So where I'll start off is I'll say that currently we have a kind of a primary resource, kind of like minerals, and a secondary resource, which is more rate limited, like Vespian gas. Let's start with the Vespian gas, the tech resource. What we really like about Vespian gas in StarCraft 2 and StarCraft 1, the StarCraft franchise specifically, is that it's rate limited, unlike wood in Warcraft 3. If you scout that your opponent has 1 Colossi at the 5-minute timing, you know that he cannot also have double forge chrono boosting at the same time, right? And that gives a lot of pro players that are experienced with the game, additional information to go off, and it adds a great degree of skill in the game. With regards to the primary resource is one that we're taking a lot of inspiration from from StarCraft 1 specifically with respect to the diminishing returns. And how that works is we want our first worker that you build to have maybe 100% mining efficiency, and your second worker to have maybe 95% efficiency, and your third worker to have 90% efficiency, and so on and so on. We think this will help accomplish 2 things. Number one, it'll it'll encourage players to expand and gain more territory. Going back to the idea that territory control is one of kind of the core gameplay pillars. And why this happens is if you have 10 workers on 2 bases, that means you're mining at a higher efficiency than if you have 10 workers on 1 base. Another thing that I think this will help with is to diminish the impact of harassment. We have a lot of games in StarCraft 2, for example, where a widow mine kills 10 workers and the game kind of feels over. When you have this diminishing returns, what happens is if you lose 50% of your workers, you maybe only lose 30% of your mining income. So it has a lot of benefits there. From the Warcraft 3 franchise and the Age of Empires franchise as well. Dan, you mentioned that you felt like the Warcraft 3 economy is a little simplistic. And I would challenge you there in that I think Warcraft 3, kind of the coolness of Warcraft 3 is also the asymmetry by which the workers mine their resources.
Yeah.
The peasants and the peons, they go into the mine. The acolytes, they mine outside the mine. The wisps mine inside the mine. And then you have wisps that are on trees, for example. And I think that's really cool because it opens up a lot of harassment opportunities. For example, for humans, you often want to kill the workers because they're exposed. For orcs, though, because the peons go into the burrows, they are often not exposed, and the harassment focuses on the burrows instead of the peons themselves. And just overall, I think in StarCraft, one issue is that the harassment, I feel like, often focuses too much on worker death, right? It's much more rare for buildings to be harassed, whereas in Warcraft 3, I feel like you have a lot more nuance in terms of how harassment is handled. So, for example, with that orc example, you're often not aiming to kill peons, but rather you're aiming to force peons to come off the worker line in order for them to stop mining wood, for example, and also to spend resources to repair those burrows. So we think there can be a lot more variety in our game relative to StarCraft 1 in terms of how these resources and how workers function in general. So hopefully that gives you an overview of how we want to design our economy system.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But that being said, is it going to be still just the 2 resources, but they just mine them in different ways from each other? Is that the idea, or is it that there might be, because some RTSs will be like, yeah, there's this other resource that this race uses that the other ones don't?
Yeah, we're still open to that, but right now in our prototypes we have 2 resources. However, that being said, we do have ideas surrounding the idea of, like in Age of Empires, there are multiple ways to gain a particular resource, for example. So that's where the Age of Empires influence comes along.
Okay, that's really cool. I like your answers. Your report card from me so far is very positive. There's a certain way RTS games should be made, and so far you guys are doing it. Okay, very good, very good. Okay, so I want to jump into the units. This is probably the biggest part of something that I wanted to mention, and it kind of bleeds over into maps, which I also want to talk about a little bit. But as far as units, is there like a golden range of unit amounts? Because I saw you guys have mentioned that in the ever-expanding universe of Stormgate, there will be regular releases of new units. So while that sounds really, really exciting, what's the number, and how do you manage that if you're going to, I saw Tim Morton talking about how, like, yeah, there's like years of content release already being prepped and planned for and everything. But how do you keep releasing units without getting above a number of units per race that you feel is good? How does that work?
Yeah, that's still something we have to talk about, but within the team. But with our philosophy with the unit count is we actually wanted to keep it relatively low. Lower than that of StarCraft 2, even maybe closer to that of StarCraft 1 or Warcraft 3. And just going back into the history of StarCraft 2, I think StarCraft 2 was kind of, as you alluded to, kind of a victim in some ways of its pricing model, in that there was a standalone product, a box model, and there were 2 expansions after that, and that it felt like it necessitated additional units per expansion. And I feel like we're at a place in Legacy of the Void where there are a lot of units in the game, that kind of overlap each other's roles. So, for example, the disruptor and the disruptor and the colossi, the carrier and the tempest, and the adept and the zealot are some of the common examples. And I think this really comes to a problem where, for example, the disruptor and the colossus, they come from the same building. They come from the same tech building even. And once a Terran player, for instance, scouts a robotic support bay, he is kind of wondering, like, is my opponent going to make a colossi or a disruptor? And at certain points of the metagame, there were drastically different counters to the colossi and to the disruptor. Like, do I build 2 liberators or do I build 2 Vikings from my starport, for example? So that's something I think we're going to be very careful about. And in order to achieve that, we want to limit the unit rosters more so than what the unit count for StarCraft 2 was.
Okay. Yeah, that makes some sense. But when you mention that also, what about like hard counters, right? So we don't have honestly perfect language. I'm sure you guys have a better lingo than what we use just online in my world for these terms. But like the thing that I would consider a hard counter would be something like an immortal, where it absolutely butchers like roaches, right? Like it counters it super hard. And StarCraft 2 has more hard counters, I would say, than StarCraft 1 has. So what is the line that you're looking for there? Like, do you want units like Immortals that just change the tide of battle? And a lot of RTS games have stuff like that, where it's like, oh, this tier 3 unit came out, all your tier 1 is garbage now, right? And that's way beyond what StarCraft 2 does. But then you look at like StarCraft 1, where there are some hard counters, but it's nothing quite like Immortal for the most part. So where do you like it in there?
Yeah, I would say that I think the philosophy is different throughout different points of the game. And I would even challenge the idea that StarCraft 2 has greater hard counters than StarCraft 1. So one example I'll give is the carrier in StarCraft 2, for instance. And I think one problem that StarCraft 2 runs into is you can kind of build this death ball that is impossible to beat or very difficult to beat, at least. And I think part of the problem is not necessarily that there's not enough hard counters, but the carrier itself as a unit is too generalized. And with respect to specifically late game unit design, we want to make it so that we have these late game armies such that they can be more easily hard countered, such that you can't ever build a late game army that is essentially impossible for your opponent to switch around his army with in order to beat. And I think actually like Warcraft 3 does this relatively well, where if you build too many of the generic air unit, your opponent can go into a super anti-air unit in order to counter that army. So what I have in mind, I guess, there is that like, if you build too many carriers, your opponent can shift his composition towards more Goliaths in order to beat that. And then the Protoss player will have to shift back into Dragoons, and then it's kind of there's never like an ultimate late game composition. And for that to happen, I think units in the late game that appear in the late game specifically have to be more specialized and therefore more hard counter each other. However, I'm talking about late game here. With respect to early game, we think it's really cool that early game units are able to persist through the entire game. So we like the idea that these units are highly microable. We like the idea that these units, they might not be very good in a straight up fight, but they are able to kind of like do kind of pokes and harassment all over the map, basically like a Zergling or a Marine type of unit, for example.
Okay. So. Yeah, I'm trying to think of exactly how to word this. Like, I guess the scaling of units. How is this going to function? Because, there's a lot of units that do get used throughout the game. Zerglings and Marines are great examples from StarCraft 2. But then you also have units like Roaches and Adepts, where while these are really powerful options early on, you will literally lose the game if you have too many of them in your army later on in the game. So, are there going to be units like that just scale really terribly? And those are units, for instance, that get hard countered in the early game, or the mid game, I guess, rather, pretty quickly. So, do you have any thoughts on that exactly?
Yeah, our goal here is to design units so that they are able to be used early game and late game. And in order to do so, for example, the Marine is a unit that tends to do that naturally. But if the unit doesn't do that naturally, we intend to have more late game upgrades in order to facilitate that. So, just an example. This has never been shared before, but back on the StarCraft 2 team, one of the examples we had, one of the ideas we had was to give Reapers a super late game upgrade that was on the tech lab of the barracks that required a fusion core that allowed the Reaper grenade to do much more damage to buildings, for instance, which would enable, in our minds, it would enable Reapers to kind of come back into the late game, whereas they are completely not used right now. It also might create interesting strategies where instead of rushing a fusion core for the battlecruiser, you actually do it for the Reaper grenades. I don't know how actually viable that would be in practice, but it's at least someone would Harston would make it in into a funny video, for instance, right?
No, I love that idea. I love that idea because there are units like that where it's kind of sad you just don't see them beyond the early game, and also Bjorn would be like a 3-time world champion if you had put that in. So I guess the whims of the balanced design team there at StarCraft 2 has really changed the course of his life. Okay, that's kind of interesting on that. Hold on. I don't want to jump exactly into maps quite yet, but it's definitely something that the units have to lead into. Okay, here's just a quick, easy one. The Dark Templar, okay, is a unit where if you are not prepared when it comes, you instantly lose the game. Are there going to be things like this? Because, the DT definitely adds some excitement to the game to a certain degree, and it's like an interesting unit when it doesn't instantly end games, but sometimes it instantly ends games, and I know players hate that. It adds a little bit of randomness, which is annoying. What is your thought on a unit like the Dark Templar?
Yeah, we're trending towards the direction of not wanting to end games with a very specific thing that you did in Scout, for instance. Especially in the case of a DT, where in some meta games it's actually very coin flippy as to whether you scouted or not, like Wings of Liberty PvP, for example. So our current design of how cloaking works in Stormgate is more similar to that of StarCraft or of Warcraft 3, where you actually break the cloak as soon as you attack something. In addition, if a DT unit in our game attacks any unit, you will receive a notification.
Okay, that's always good. That's such a stupid thing about StarCraft 1, man. Okay, and here's a thought, and I feel like I already know what you're going to answer, but I think that a big problem that occurred between StarCraft 1 and StarCraft 2, like a lot of the changes makes sense, right? Like a lot of the accessibility of RTS was helped by doing things like multiple building selection and unlimited control groups and stuff. Although I think obviously anyone that loves StarCraft 1 can tell that those are big things that help make that game what it is and make it great. But one of the things that, and I've argued this before about StarCraft 2, I think would actually make the game a lot better, is if smart casting did not exist for spellcasters in StarCraft 2, right? Because this has been something since Wings of Liberty right through now where we've seen countless nerfs to spellcasters because, if you have 8 High Templars on one hotkey and you cast a storm, only one storm goes down. Whereas in Brood War, 8 storms will go down and suddenly you're screwed, right? So it makes using spellcasters in battle much more skill-based in StarCraft 1 and much more balanced in StarCraft 1 than StarCraft 2, because StarCraft 2, you just instantly do everything you want perfectly. So do you have any thoughts on that? Because I don't know. I don't like how the smart casting works in StarCraft 2, and I would challenge anyone who does.
Yeah, I think smart casting really adds to the approachability of StarCraft 2, and that's probably not something that I would change. However, that being said, I think rapid fire is something to look at specifically in StarCraft 2. So specifically in regards to how it's really changed the landscape and how StarCraft is played in general. We've seen, for example, countless nerfs to snipe, seeker missiles, where this is a problem. And I think actually a problem with modern StarCraft right now, modern StarCraft 2, is creep spread. In the past, in Wings of Liberty and Heart of the Swarm, you often had players like Scarlet, for example, who could differentiate themselves with their incredible creep spread. But right now, everyone has insane creep spread because players have learned the technique of rapid firing out their creep tumors. And I think it's changed the game in that, like, there's no longer you no longer need to pay as much attention to it, and it's no longer as much of a choice. So that's something that we're looking at right now.
Okay, yeah, because I think that is such a, the speed of the clicking and like jumping around to queens to creep spread, for instance, how it was done in the beginning, that it became very impressive. And yeah, I mean, I think that's something that all RTS games need to really think about and look at, because just massing spellcasters because it's so easy to cast those spells has not been a healthy thing for StarCraft 2. We've seen that so many times. Okay, so I'd like to one more thing about units. The micro ability of units, right? There's a lot of different ways to micro, like and I wonder what type of approach you're going to take, because StarCraft 1 and StarCraft 2 have really, really different micro in the way that it works. Like, for instance, in StarCraft 2, probably the most micro-intensive thing might be like spreading perfectly against banelings while targeting everything, right? That's like insanity. But then you look at like Mutalisks in StarCraft 1 versus StarCraft 2. In StarCraft 1, there's so much skill differentiation in Mutalisk micro, it's insanity. Whereas in StarCraft 2, Mutas are more of a tactical unit, right? There's no actual micro there. You just fly them around and you know how to use them. So what are you looking at creating micro-wise for units?
Yeah, one of the inspirations that we take a look at, one of the biggest inspirations is StarCraft 1, where you have things like Reaver drops, where you have things like Vulture micro or Muta micro. And I think the inspiration or the learnings there is that a lot of the micro involved has to do with the movement of the units themselves. If you just right-click a unit to a certain location, for instance, it does one thing. It does it perfectly fine, but it's not necessarily like the best way to do it. And to allow players to differentiate themselves by altering how the units move or how they behave, I think it's something that allows these like more competitive players to differentiate themselves, as long as the base functionality of right clicking still feels all right. So that's one way in which we plan to still maintain the skill ceiling from the StarCraft 1 days, to allow players to differentiate themselves by moving units in different ways.
I'm a little bit confused how you can do that, right? Because we talk about how StarCraft 1 was like this beautiful accident, and like new micro tricks are still being learned. I wonder how you can kind of get the best of both worlds here, because like like the Mutalisk micro just doesn't exist in StarCraft 2. I don't know how they would make it exist. It's just with the way the game functions. So I'm sorry, I'm just a bit confused on how.
So something very very small is the idea of unit deceleration, right? In StarCraft 1, in StarCraft 2 specifically, what ends up happening is that units essentially accelerate and decelerate very quickly. Ground units do this instantaneously, and air units in StarCraft 1, StarCraft 2 tend to have much higher acceleration and deceleration rates. I'll give you another example from the StarCraft 2 development days, when there was a point in the development cycle where we actually were thinking of adding Scourge to StarCraft 2. And we eventually did not do it because we realized that when you patrol units, they maintain their acceleration. So dodging Scourge would be much less of a factor, right? It'd be relatively easy because you just constantly patrol your units, and you would allow them to maintain full acceleration, so that dodging Scourge would never be a problem. In StarCraft 1, how this works is, if you patrol like a science vessel, for instance, the science vessel will actually reach its endpoint, and as it's reaching its endpoint, it will decelerate to a stop, and then it'll accelerate to full speed while starting going in the opposite direction. So patrolling is not viable in StarCraft 2. So we would have to make, if we were to implement Scourge, we would either A, have to like rewrite the engine such that patrol works completely differently, or B, we would have to accept that players kind of do this degenerate gameplay of when they're not doing anything with their air units, they're always patrolling their air units. So yeah, modifying specific things like behaviors with patrol, things like adding deceleration, things like modifying how quickly units can move if they, for example, change direction, are kind of simple things that we're thinking about right now.
Okay. That I actually just learned a lot right there. Thank you. That's very enlightening. That would be how you would actually add some of that stuff. That's cool. Okay. Let's kind of shift a little bit over to maps, because I think that this is kind of a big thing. First off, the thoughts for 1v1 mode on like 2-player maps, 3-player maps, 4-player maps, or possibly even more player maps. You know, obviously, in StarCraft 1, we've capped it at 4-player maps for 1v1 mode, whereas in StarCraft 2, other than the one map we get each GSL season, it has gone down to only 2-player maps. So do you guys have like a thought process on what you're looking at for that?
Yeah, the current direction right now is that A, we would have more than 2-player maps, but B, if you we would show you where your opponent spawned on the map if it were a 4-player map, for instance. What we want to do there is we want to avoid situations where it's like Wings of Liberty PvP, and you didn't scout in the right direction, or you'd be forced to scout with 2 probes. And if you didn't scout correctly, you would just essentially lose the game. We still like the slight variability in that, yes, you could spawn cross position or you could spawn close position. But I think there are situations where it hurts the game too much with the amount of RNG involved, and as in you don't scout in the correct direction.
Okay. I would say, though, as a counter to that part of the reason why that's so painful in StarCraft 2 is because the economy gets going so quickly, whereas in StarCraft 1, you know, like, you start the game and your first building in StarCraft 1 oftentimes starts around 1 minute in, whereas in StarCraft 2, you're literally expanding at 1 minute, right? So I don't know if you've ever seen that Terrancraft article on the starting worker counts. Sure. I think it's one of the smartest things ever written by anyone in RTS, but yeah, I would kind of challenge that the RNG of spawn location and scouting has more to do with how quickly your economy picks up than anything else. So I don't know if you'd agree, or if this is like, are you looking at just starting the economy super fast like StarCraft 2 or what?
Yeah, that's a good point. So with regards to the 6-worker versus 12-worker debate, I think that's something that like has been constant ever since it was done, in the sense that there's been a constant debate around it. And my stance on that is that I think the 12-worker start, even though there are a lot of benefits to the 6-worker start, the 12-worker start was overall the better option, because it allowed players to essentially get into the game more quickly. There were a lot of games in the 6-worker start that worked exactly the same, in that you were playing for 6 or 7 minutes, and you were playing the same exact strategies. You were doing the same rote things over and over again, if you were playing that macro style. And it was a lot for players in that, yes, there could be more variability early on, but for the majority of games, players were kind of just repeating the same task over and over again. So an example I like to give is like, in your casts, Dan, like there was a lot of times in Wings of Liberty and Heart of the Storm where I felt like you're kind of just like going off with tasteless about just like the most random stuff in the world. Like, and I think that suits your strengths, but a lot of other casters, maybe like they were not able to fill that time as effectively. They were kind of just repeating the same things over and over again.
Yeah. I can't really argue with that too much. Although, I mean, I've never heard anyone say or think that StarCraft 2 maps are better or more interesting than StarCraft 1 maps, so I think there is still something to be explored there as far as allowing different spawn locations. Like, you get very, very, very different feels on 3-player maps and 4-player maps than 2. So just something I'm kind of like keeping in my mind here, because I've seen it a lot as a common complaint in StarCraft 2, where a lot of the maps are kind of the same thing. Yeah, it's like, totally. How many S-shaped centers are we going to have? And it's like, yeah, it's a little bit different. And I mean, it does give a little bit different game, but it's it's not as good as StarCraft 1 where you get something fucking crazy and it's like,
Yeah,
whoa, that's that's insane.
I totally agree. I think I've actually, so I worked on, before I joined Blizzard, I worked on the Team Liquid map contest in which I was trying to push people towards making like interesting maps. And my wish never got fulfilled. I mean, maybe it'll get fulfilled in Stormgate, but I really wanted someone to make Outsider work in StarCraft 2.
Yeah.
It was my favorite map in StarCraft 1, and it for a bunch of reasons, it never got made. And that's something we're looking into in Stormgate. I think the problem with a lot of maps in StarCraft 2 is that they're very limited by the mechanics of the game itself. So just some examples. Right now, the meta is based around, can my Reaper go into my opponent's main, right? And it's balanced around, there's always this like exact same size Reaper cliff. That's very limiting for map design. Liberators were another unit that was really warping to map design, and that you had to have X amount of airspace behind mains. In Wings of Liberty, because Protoss versus Zerg was so balanced around force fields, basically the first three bases of every map had to be exactly the same, and it had to be like you had to make it so that force fields could cover, or 3 or 4 force fields could cover the choke of the third base. So I think I would argue that the reason why there's a lack of diversity in StarCraft 2 is because of, number one, these individual unit mechanics that force very specific things on maps, and number two, because of the relative lack of defender's advantage in StarCraft 2, where you can kind of just run over your opponent, and the maps have to be balanced around the fact to give that defender's advantage rather than the units or the mechanics themselves.
100%. That was literally the exact next thing I was going to talk about, was sentries and stalkers and stuff, and how that's kind of warped maps and kind of destroyed what can be made. So you're going to specifically avoid things like the map editor robot.
What's the? Oh, yes, yeah.
I mean, it fucked up all the maps in the early days. Remember, it's like, yeah, you just can't have a map that looks like this because 2 force fields come down and the Protoss wins, right? It's just, that stuff's silly.
Yeah, and something, if I can get on my soapbox a bit, something that I think something that players don't realize is a lot of why maps are the way they are right now, and this is like kind of like completely unrelated, is because of the process by which maps are made, which is through the TLMC. I have this like funny story where there's this map maker. He was a really good custom map maker by the name of The Music. He made some of the best like custom maps ever. And then he tried to get into competitive map design. And his first season, he didn't do that well. He didn't make it to the finals. But then like something clicked for him, and he realized, oh, there's a formula by which you can make maps with, and everyone will love these maps. And in the very next season, he took a lot of feedback. He figured out the formula. He placed in the finals with all 4 maps. From then on, like the meta around map making was like, can you please the community with more generic maps? Can you follow the formula? And I think it's a very like niche topic about like why current maps are the way they are, but that is like my background history.
I love it
with why that is right now.
Yeah, it reminds me of Marvel movies right now. Absolutely, I get it. It's
I dig at Marvel movies. I don't know if I can handle that, Dan.
No, I like that answer, and actually, that I was going to ask about TLMC because, like, are you guys looking at creating a bunch of maps in-house? Like, I assume we're going to open with a bunch of in-house maps that are on the ladder and whatnot, but is this going to be something where you like crowdsource it to the community, that type of thing?
Yeah, our idea of where maps will come from, I think, will follow very similarly to what happened with StarCraft, in that initially the first maps will be made by Frost Giant, and then as we develop the metagame and players understand like what is necessary to create a good map, I think we'll try to hand it off more and more to the community, such that we're not playing with the same maps as always as like the beginning of when you guys played in GSL on like Desert Oasis and like Delta Quadrant. Do you remember those days, Trevor?
Oh yeah. Happy to move beyond those.
Okay. And I mean, we already talked about it a little bit, but the last part, map. Well, I guess there's two more things. You talked about trying to get players out on the map for for different reasons to actually move around, to like expand, to take more quadrants and stuff. And we've seen that done very well in some RTS games. And then not as well in some other RTS games. Like, for instance, I would say like Dawn of War 1, I thought was really good as far as trying to utilize the map. But then something like, for instance, Watchtowers, we've seen those kind of phase out in StarCraft 2 a little bit because of the snowballing effect. Like, is there anything that you have really in mind for getting people to utilize more of the map? Because it also feels like on some of these maps, like especially in StarCraft 2, there will be areas of the map that just don't get looked at or touched, other than you're hiding a dark shrine there, until way late into the game.
Yeah, so with regards to Watchtowers, I think, like you mentioned, map design has shifted away from using Watchtowers, and I think one important distinction there is that it's specifically shifted towards away from Watchtowers in the middle of the map, where the winning player can get more of an advantage. I think they've moved towards the edges of the map, where it's less about the winner who's controlling them, rather than and it's more about like one tower might naturally go to one player, for instance. And I think those are like map design lessons that we won't, like examples of map design lessons that we won't know at the advent of Stormgate, when we have all these new mechanics, and that we'll have to learn over time. With regards to specific examples of what we're looking to, is the idea of one idea is the idea of respawnable creep camps, right? In Warcraft 3, we had these creep camps that awarded experience, awarded gold, awarded items. But one problem with those creep camps is the idea that after you killed these creep camps and after the whole map was crept out, you basically, there was no incentive ever to go out into the map for the most part, and you had players just camping in their bases. So if these creep camps respawn over time, that's a constant. Not only is it a constant reminder for players and an incentive for players to move out into the map, but at the same time, it creates moments where you're pushed towards one sector of the map that's maybe unused, or pushed towards the other sector of the map that's unused.
Okay. And just a couple more quick questions, and I do want to jump into esports. I'm so sorry.
Yes, esports.
How much on game design, but I need to know these things. Okay. Real quick, what actual RNG will exist in the game? Like in StarCraft 1, there's spawn position, high ground miss chance, 1 in 250, low ground miss chance, the slight desync of attacks for graphical purposes, and SCVs dancing around to make buildings. Obviously, there's much less in StarCraft 2. But like, what RNG can we expect? Do you like any of these? Like, a lot of people prefer StarCraft 1 high ground mechanics because it's a better defender's advantage than just not seeing. But what do you think?
Yeah, I think like spawn positions, if we have more than 2-player maps, is something that we'll want in our game, with the caveat that we already talked about revealing where you spawn at the start. Another thing that we like is the high ground mischance from StarCraft 1. Generally, especially in the 1v1 mode, we want to generally reduce the amount of RNG. However, I think StarCraft 1 mischance is something that works really well because it, number one, reinforces the idea of defender's advantage, and number two, from just like a player understanding perspective, I think it's much easier to understand, rather than my attack is dealing, let's say, 40% less damage because I'm shooting up. Right, because there's not as much of like a visual impact. There's not as many visual changes from that.
Okay. And one more here, the Protoss problem. This is actually like competitive players will literally, like, I've seen this so many times where if you jump into a new RTS that you haven't really played, you literally ask good players like, which race is Protoss, right? Because this is a real thing. I see people in the chat laughing at everything, but like, there's always going to be a race that's easier. That's just the way it is. You literally can't design it any other way. There's going to be a race that is easier to utilize. And like, for instance, if you look at the ladders right now in Brood War, 43% of all players play Protoss. What is the GM in StarCraft 2 of Protoss? It's like 50%, right? So it's just like, that's a thing that exists, and people get frustrated by that. And, you know, obviously, and even for the people who play Protoss themselves, they're playing mirror matchups all day. It can be frustrating. So I just wonder if you have some sort of idea to keep that type of thing in check.
Yeah, the main first of all, we're going to have a Protoss race. I don't know who it is, but this is definitely going to happen. I think in any
It's got to be
RTS.
the demons. They're evil. Like, we already hate them, right? Like,
That would make sense. I would say in terms of mitigation, we have to have mechanics in the game that are very skill testing, and we have to be willing to lean towards those mechanics. So, for example, warp prism drops are something that is something that in Protoss, specifically Immortal drops, right, or Archon drops, is something that I think is very skill testing for Protoss, and it allows Protoss players to differentiate themselves from other Protoss players. I think Stats is a great example of someone who really, when Immortal drops were at the top of the meta, when Archon drops were at the top of the meta, he was able to kind of maneuver those drops in a way that a lot of other Protoss players couldn't. So number one, we try to incorporate a lot of these mechanics in our designs, and number two, try to push the meta towards these kind of more high skill cap interactions.
okay. All right, fair enough. And I'm sure that we'll see when it comes out, like how how heavily the game skews towards certain races and whatnot. Okay, I want to jump over before we start to get low on time or anything, because I have a lot of esports questions as well. I'm so sorry, Torch, you had to sit through all those.
No, this is great information and lovely to hear it every single time.
Well,
I get to hang out now.
Yeah. Well, please interject if you have any ideas on any of these as well. Okay, so I guess some of the big questions, right? Like, there's going to be a competitive 1v1 mode, which, you know, this is kind of the standard for RTS. You guys have also talked about having a 3v3 mode. Like, do you want there to be esports for both? Are you going to launch with esports for both? Are they both going to be highly competitive? Like, how is that going to look exactly? Because honestly, and here's the thing, I'm like a 1v1 guy through and through, but like 3v3 is really popular in Brood War and Korea. People love it. They play it all the time. The pros play it. They stream it. It's like there's definitely something there in this idea. So I just wonder what you guys want to like push, launch with, what your aspirations are with that.
Yeah, that's definitely a complicated question and exactly what we've been talking a lot about. Where we're currently at right now is that we see professional 1v1 as the way that we want to launch and make sure is at the highest possible it can be. So making sure we have the right resources, the right partners, where we have the right venues for hearing feedback and reacting to that feedback. So with a lot of my focus, it's how do we make that near perfect, and how do we make it so that it's done in a sustainable and scalable way that feels right for the right time in beta, right at launch, right for years after launch. So very interested in continuing to work through that and figure out exactly how we're going to do 1v1 and the scale and everything else along those lines. But I'm also super excited about 3v3. I'm also seeing a lot of the same things that you just mentioned about other RTS games that have had successful team games. And when we talk about trying to expand out the number of players that are interested in RTS and the social aspect of RTS, team games are clearly a way that help us tap into that extra enthusiasm and ability to work with people. So we're not currently seeing 3v3 as a professional ecosystem at launch, but we do expect there to still be tons of tournaments, especially at like the collegiate and the local level, that will support that way of playing. And as that community grows and more people are interested in watching it and participating, we'll make sure that we're there to continue to find ways to produce the resources that can then continue to support that growth. And just something we're really excited about. So not a perfect answer to give to you today, but
sure.
we can be pretty clear. Like, yes, professionally, if you're trying to get into this game and be a professional player, focus on 1v1. But if you're interested in being a competitor and really going deeper and seeing who are the best teams around the world, maybe even nation-focused teams, like maybe 3v3 is going to be the focus for that a year or two after launch.
Yeah. I really do wonder about that because, like, again, I don't want teammates, but like it's exciting like that. 3v3 very popular in Brood War. I personally, what was it called? W3CL way back in the day with Warcraft 3, where they had the 2v2 portion. That was awesome. That was badass. It was super cool to see the the pro 1v1 players play with each other, or occasionally there'd be a team that was like, these guys aren't 1v1ers, but they're very good at 2v2. So I'm kind of excited to see that. But I wonder if there's like, is there a possibility, because this seems very confusing for a viewer, that you might have different patches for the two modes, but at the same time, occasionally you get stuff that's screwed up where you have to make special rules for team games. Like when StarCraft 1 had professional 2v2, they had to make a rule that you couldn't go double Zerg because it was too strong. That was just a rule that they had to add in because it's like, well, it ruins it because it's always Zerg versus Zerg. So is there like a possibility of different balance patches for that? And if not, do you ever steer balance? Will you ever affect balance in 1v1 to fix 3v3 or something like that?
At the base level, we want to make sure that esports feels like it's part of the game. So when you're talking about balance or how it's actually played in esports tournaments versus ranked play or even casual play, like we want to make sure that that's a very easy and smooth process so that people that see the pros playing on a particular broadcast like can go and actually try to replicate the strategies and those build orders and everything else along those lines. So like it shouldn't feel separate in that regard. Whether or not the balance or even the win conditions are the same between 1v1 and 3v3, that's something we're still exploring. Kevin, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more in detail about that part.
Yeah, sure. So with regards to your question specifically, the short answer is we are going to try to make the balance the same as much as possible between the two different game modes. We'll see how successful we are at that. But how we're going to differentiate the two game modes is we are going to build the 3v3 from the ground up. In almost every RTS, the 3v3 rules are a carbon copy of the 1v1 rules. And it's not really built with 3v3 in mind. So the best example from StarCraft is you can't build creep on your allies' bases. And we just don't think that makes a lot of sense in a 3v3 mode. Something else that doesn't make sense is the idea that if you take a look at all other team-based esports, when you die in the game, you eventually respawn. You're able to come back into the game and help your allies. And this is not true for Blizzard-style RTSs or RTSs in general, where the win condition is essentially to eliminate people. It's very beneficial to completely eliminate players of the game. So that's one example of something that we're looking at to kind of design and like revolutionize how team games are played in RTS. So the long answer to your question is, in order to balance the two different game modes, we're going to try to, in order to shift the balance rather of the two different game modes, we're going to try to change the underlying game rules themselves rather than the different factions so that players can come into the 1v1 mode, play that game, be familiarized with a particular faction, and then jump immediately to the 3v3 mode and vice versa.
Okay. No, that's actually really interesting. I hadn't even thought of just changing the rules. I'm imagining Respawn, like how that would possibly work, but it's exciting. It's like a cool idea. I could see it's like, oh yeah, he respawns and he has a small army, so you kill your teammates right at the beginning. Everyone attacks their own command centers. Anyways, okay, that's cool to hear. Okay, so excuse me. So like StarCraft 2, obviously there's like all these different esports out there run in different ways, but if you look at specifically StarCraft 2 and the way that esports has run since the very beginning, we've gone through so many phases. Like we had that very open phase in the beginning where there was a lot of competition, ESL, DreamHack, MLG were all kind of battling to make the best product. It felt very healthy. It felt very cool. And then Blizzard kind of came in, took over, kind of eliminated all that, made the WCS, which was really awesome. There's like, what are you looking to do here? Because if you look at esports, like as someone that has worked in the industry forever, different types of esports feel very differently, right? Like for instance, Counter-Strike, the publisher does not pay people to do Counter-Strike tournaments, whereas a lot of esports nowadays is just the publisher paying for it, and that feels like a very small, like shrinking type thing. Whereas when people are competing, like in Counter-Strike, it feels like very open-ended. It feels like it has a very bright future. But that future might not be as guaranteed as a publisher-backed one. So I just wonder what the idea is to start this out.
Yeah, definitely things that we're exploring a lot as well, and I've been through a lot of those different types of models. For us with Stormgate, what we want to do is make sure that there's a dependable foundation. We're building this game with a very long lifespan in mind, so we want to make sure that there's some possibility that people, like, maybe they're not getting what they want in year one for that particular individual, but they can depend on us to grow to what they're looking for over time. So what I'm really focused on is making sure that we can develop a foundation that, regardless of how exciting it is at launch, we're able to say, like, absolutely, there will be a certain amount of support for pro players so that they can make a living in this game. There's a certain amount of support for tournament organizers and all the staff that goes on behind the scenes, that this can be part of their career. And then anything that you're talking about from third parties being able to come in and do really cool one-off events or mix it in with another series like IEM or something else along those lines, that is still something that feels additive and doesn't take away from the narrative that is there as that foundation. So a lot of my experience in the last few years at Blizzard was making sure that we were trying to build that third-party ecosystem with licensing processes in a way that was more welcoming. And we're trying to take a lot of those lessons and build that into Stormgate, even in the beta phase, so that if someone wants to run a really cool event in beta and it just times out perfectly, like, we want to be able to support that and have that be something that can be built on top of the narrative foundation that we're going to be doing first party.
Okay. And so it sounds like a little bit mixed. I like the idea of, like, kind of supporting third party, but is there going to be, like, levels of officialness, for lack of my vocabulary here, where for instance, if you look at StarCraft 2 at the beginning, there was nothing super official, right? It's like, okay, well, GSL is probably the best tournament, so that's, like, the best player, I guess. But then you have, like, the MLG is, like, pretty important, and then, like, occasionally there's a BlizzCon, but it wasn't WCS yet. So is that the world champion because Blizzard made it, right? Like, there's, and I think that this is something I've heard Counter-Strike fans talk about in Counter-Strike, where it's, like, a little bit harder. Even though there's a lot of hype and it's very exciting, it's a little bit harder to say, like, who's the best, like, which tournament matters the most, that type of thing. What kind of direction are you going to try to add there?
Yeah, everything is very subject to change based on exact timing in the world when we're running these events. But we're looking to get to a steady state where we do have an official first-party annual championship that everything points to. So however big third-party tournaments are, or our circuit around the world in different regions for seasons leading up to that annual championship, is getting us the best players that are going on in the world. And likely we'll do some sort of point system to get to that point, but I can't reveal any details about exactly how that's going to function right now. But that culminating narrative is something that we see as really powerful for answering that question that you just brought up, like, who is the best player of 2027 kind of example, and what are the strategies that can be built out of there, and all sorts of promotion and being able to tie into the fandom that's going to exist. Like, that's very powerful and very important for us to build. But like I was trying to mention before, like, we don't want to choke out third parties from being able to run cool things. We don't want to make it so that you have to be working with us in exactly our ways to be able to create a really cool event for the community. We want it to be open. We want to tap back into that grassroots that made esports to begin with, and make sure that that's part of this legacy that we're building on top of.
Okay, very cool. What are your thoughts on, like, obviously the game has not come out yet, but with the amount of hype that it's generating, it really feels like it's going to be another StarCraft 2, where, like, the whole world's excited and there's lots of tournaments and there's, like, sponsors coming in for players and things like this. I wonder, like, what your guys' stance might be towards something like region locking, right? Because there's going to be stronger areas. Like, if the Koreans like Stormgate, they're going to be very, very good. And there is always a possibility that a couple of big sponsor teams pick up the best Korean players and they do the MC World Tour, where they just fly around, or Tasia, right? Like, just fly around and win everything. So is that something that's, like, okay? Is that encouraged even? Is that something that you really want to try to avoid? How do you look at that?
Yeah, for us, it's going to be a lot of what does the tech even enable? So are we able to have cross-region play online that feels like it has the right level of integrity for us to build a professional circuit on? We're not going to have the answers to that question until we get into the beta phase and start getting on our production hardware for networking all over the world for that type of stuff. But certainly would be lovely if it didn't matter where in the world you were coming from and you still had the potential to be playing in a Korean team or anything along those lines. So yeah, I don't have a satisfying answer for you today, but likely we are going to try to make sure there are regional paths or regional paths to pro, so that you can focus on attainable goals of the people around you and have that be that pressure that's getting you excited to play more and getting you some little victories that are enticing you to keep playing more and keep developing your skills. And then when we start to get to those annual championships and larger circuits, that's where we don't want to do a hard region lock. We want to make sure that we find the best players and develop the best narratives and get the best practice for everyone. But depending on the realities of exactly what you're bringing up, like if one particular region of the world is super into this and the other regions of the world are a little lighter, we need to figure out ways of kind of balancing that out. And we'll be working with tournament organizers all over the world to kind of partner on solving that challenge from the beginning. So we don't want to wait until it becomes a problem to then solve that problem. And we'll be testing like how is that actually going along in early beta throughout launch and beyond.
Okay. And you actually just hit upon this, which was I thought I was going to bring in this awesome question, but like you already kind of answered it. But there's like a built-in delay in StarCraft 2 that does make it more playable across regions, but it's definitely not perfect, right? So yeah, I just wonder like how big of a deal that will be, because obviously that can affect responsivity. In StarCraft 1, you go all the way up to LAN speeds, like turn rate 24, where it's like insane how close it is. And then as soon as you travel away from Korea, like you start getting latency. Whereas, StarCraft 2, it does affect it. Like what is the built-in response? Like 250 or something like that. But like, if you see, for instance, Maru's win rate goes down when he's playing on the European server, right? Because it's harder for him. But I mean, you mentioned that you want to keep like as much integrity online as possible, but like how heavily is this going to be balanced into the actual design of the game so that it's similar to offline or whatever?
Yeah, I would answer it more as it's going to factor into our design of esports, not necessarily the design of the game itself. We're going to make the game the best experience it can be. But what is very important for us on the esports side is making sure that there is that competitive integrity for every match that takes place, that two players going into the same match are having a fair experience, and trying to find that consistency of competition so that if someone is playing on super fast ping, super fast response time their entire year, we don't want to then drop them into an annual championship where now it's a different condition that doesn't feel good. So as we're designing competition to even get qualifying and get into the professional circuits and then beyond to the championship, factoring in technical aspects of how you play the game is certainly part of the whole exploration.
Yeah, I mean, you just made me think of it when you said it. Like if you have a more standard way, like if you remember Warcraft 3, they'd have to find certain hosts in certain areas to try to make the game lag better. And then right now in StarCraft 2, obviously you have different pings to different servers, and they try to balance it out by switching servers back and forth when they're playing online. But like maybe if there's some sort of server that you can connect to where it's like, no, this is 300 ping for both of you, something like that. I don't know if something like that's possible, but I don't know. I'm interested in that type of thing because it kind of hurts sometimes seeing players play in lag where it's like, oh, you have a micro-based style. Oh, you're not going to win this year, Mario. I'm so sorry. It's online. That's tough.
Yeah, there's certainly interesting tech that is being built in a variety of games. I know Overwatch had that in the last couple of years. We can't answer exactly how Stormgate's going to land, but this is very much a conversation we're having and questions we're going to have answered. And as it relates to esports, we'll have it answered before we have our rule sets that say, hey, this is the fair way to play.
All right. So as far as like tournaments to ladder, how well is that going to line up? Because I've always been a fan of when games keep the ladder map pool the same as tournaments. At the same time, like I could see you wanting to allow tournaments to kind of do what they want with a pool like that, but there's a certain accessibility that feels nice when you're watching a tournament. You're like, I play on these maps, like that's for me personally, I enjoy that. Whereas when they play something wild, I'm like, well, I mean, I can learn a little bit watching this, but it's not exactly my experience. So how closely do you want to like intertwine the ladder and tournament spheres?
Yeah, for third-party events, we want it to be pretty flexible and open so that people can get creative if you want to run a tournament on a single map. have at it, and we're gonna support that with the right promotion to hit your target audience. For our official play that we're talking about, like from the professional side, we are really excited about building the esports schedule exactly in line with the game content release schedule. So when there's a new tile set for the game, or as heroes are part of the competitive play, when there's new heroes launched, like esports is going to be able to build on top of that at the same cadence. So all of the excitement that's happening around streamers and you being able to play with your friends, we want the pros to also be kind of in that same culture and building on that same excitement. So that we're really excited about. And then we can have exactly what you're talking about of the ranked play that you're playing in online ladder as any player is also what the pro players are really refining the exact builds that are top of the world at that time. And you can learn from that. You can get excited about it. Maybe you can come up with the ultimate counter to the professionals' build order, but you are going to need to be the one to kind of popularize that and get that out there to get the fame for it if you want to.
So I like the idea of like kind of coinciding the content releases and seasons and things like this, but do you like, how is this going to work with things like patch scheduling, right? Like, we've seen this before where something will get really imbalanced and like there will be a patch in the middle of a tournament and it's like, ooh, you know, there's no good answer here. So what's your thought?
Our best answer is aligning our tournament schedule with our patch schedule. So obviously there will be hot fixes and other things that we won't necessarily expect and we'll react as we need to. But for the cadence that we're building out for a balance patch standpoint, like we can know ahead of time and with our first party program kind of build in like, okay, this is when that patch is going to be out. Here's roughly how long we expect the pro players to need to kind of figure out their strategies. Now we start the higher stakes competition after that point. Kevin, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about any sort of ways that we're testing balance or getting that out.
Yeah, I just want to add that, yes, even though we are talking a lot about more seasonal content across all our game modes, and we want to align patches around that seasonal content, that does not preclude us from necessarily making emergency balance changes in the middle of a season, perhaps. And that's something I think at Frost Giant, where I think one of the benefits of being at a smaller company like Frost Giant is that we are able to have more open communication with both pro players on a private level and also with the public on a larger scale. So we're going to be more in tune with what the community needs and more communicate what our plans are. One thing that I learned while we were on the StarCraft team is there was a period where I don't exactly know what was happening, but the community perception was that the game was very imbalanced, and we knew we weren't ready for a balance patch. So what we did is we communicated the things that we're thinking about and that we were not ready for a balance patch. And actually, to my surprise, the community like uproar died a lot. Like I would say like 80-90% of the uproar died. And it was not necessarily because there was any changes to balance, but rather the idea that the devs were listening and the devs were communicating with them. So that's a big lesson that we learned from back then. And also, the sun is setting. So
okay, so actually, another question here, Torch, about the patches and like keeping integrity and everything, like because this feels more. Well, it feels like it's a combination, I guess, of esports and of the actual game design itself. But I wonder what patching method you guys are looking more towards, because I've definitely heard it both ways, where some people really like the game to be very shaken up, perhaps in between seasons, and really just kind of mess with things, stir the pot quite a bit. And then there's other approaches where it's like, okay, do this small change and let things settle and let pros really figure out where the game is going. And I've definitely heard arguments in both directions for keeping integrity within a professional scene. So I don't have like a super strong opinion on this, but what are you looking at for it?
Yeah, so Kevin's going to need to answer the specific patch details, but from the esports side, we are being pretty explicit that we want the ranked play in the game to be the same as the pro play. So we don't want to have different patches for the tournaments versus what people can go and play competitively on their own. The other thing I would want to point out is that when we talk about esports, we're not just talking about professional play. We're also talking about how to get more people just in organized competition and feeling the joys of hitting that bracket and seeing your name on there. And when you win, like that just has that much more like pride and everything else that you can talk with your friends about. So from a professional standpoint, that's just that consistency and predictability of like, okay, there's this patch that I can practice on. I can refine my builds and everything else to be the best it can possibly be in the world. But from the more casual side of competition, which is kind of a misnomer, but it's fun, having stuff be fresh and the first day that a patch lands or new characters land and new units, like that is also a really exciting time to get people to try out competition. So we are going to have a lot of more on the automated or help tech facilitated competitions as early as possible in that time, so that people can go and feel like it has less stakes, but is even more exciting to kind of like try out new things and go through in that way. And that kind of speaks to different types of competitors as well. But yeah, your actual question, Kevin, do you mind jumping in there?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I kind of want to talk about our time on StarCraft 2 again and the philosophy around the StarCraft 2 team. So the philosophy for StarCraft 2 was definitely more leading towards a game state where there didn't need to be patches made. And that was primarily influenced by two factors. The first is that we wanted to respect the legacy of StarCraft 1, a game that did not have patches for basically forever. That was a game in which you could truly test your mastery and grind, knowing that the game will never change, knowing that the skills that you've perfected will still be able to persist in the long term. The second factor was, especially near the end of when I left the team, the balance team was always concerned about like, hey, are we going to get another patch, right? So that was another reason that we never wanted to bring the game into a state where we knew we wouldn't get to another patch, but there was a lot of like very degenerate gameplay, for instance. And for those two reasons combined, we were always on the more conservative side of patching overall. With our philosophy at Stormgate, I will say that I think we're leaning to be more proactive and kind of more shake up the meta. So not just in competitive, but for all game modes, we learned a lot of lessons from Path of Exile, and not only Path of Exile, but streamers in general. There's a very like popular and famous GDC talk where one of the heads of Path of Exile talked about speaking to Kripparrian, another very famous streamer, and Kripparrian gave him advice that goes along the lines of, hey, like why I can be successful as a streamer, one of the main reasons, it's consistency. It's the idea that my viewers can expect for me to show up at 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. at every single time, every day, and they know they'll have this content. They know, like, maybe I go on vacation, I'm out of the country for like a month or so, but when I return, Kripparrian's still there at 5 or 6 a.m. every day. It's just like clockwork. And in terms of game development, how that comes into play is that, people are busy in their everyday lives. And sometimes an industry term is they churn from the game. They stop playing the game. But for a game like StarCraft or any other game where there's inconsistent content releases, it's really confusing for a player to come back into the game. They don't know when the next best time to come is. But if we have more seasonal, more regular and expected content releases of things such as new like co-op commanders, new campaign content, even new shakes-ups of balance patches, that is an approachable way for a player that has churned from the game in order to return and become part of the player base again. And you can see that from like Path of Exile's data, in that every time there is a new season, you do get that uptick, and every year or every season it becomes higher and higher. So that's a lot of philosophy for our content cadence right now.
Okay, that makes sense. Actually, Torch, I did want to jump in actually to what you kind of mentioned there. That's a little bit goes against itself, but the casual side of competition, because I've definitely heard you guys at Frost Giant mention about having like in-game esports and kind of making it more accessible even for lower level players to be able to play some tournaments. And I wonder, is this just like the StarCraft 2 automated tournaments all over again, or is it going to be a bit better than that? Like, how do you go about providing that kind of competitive itch that isn't necessarily ladder for some of the world's not best players?
Yeah, this is going to be a constantly evolving answer as we go through the cycle. And one of the things that we're really excited about with the longevity of the game that we're building is that we can focus on certain features in beta and then develop those features in launch, and then even years after launch, continue to iterate on them and focus on what's working and what the feedback is. Where we're hoping to build what we're calling integrated esports is having a tool set that gives us the power to do all of what you just said. Yes, automated tournaments could be facilitated with this technology, or just having like streamer level tournaments or something even more grassroots focused on smaller groups of people that want to have facilitated competition that don't necessarily need to go out of client or off platform to be able to do that. So we're focused on building into the actual engineering of the game to have the right hooks to be able to build that tools and enable that tools for whatever we or our third parties are looking to do. So can't reveal exactly what those feature sets are going to be immediately at launch, but that's kind of the philosophy of where we're trying to get to, is creating the tools that can be built for whatever vision that we have or that our partners have. And really the goal is around increasing the discoverability of casual players to be able to watch and participate in competitions. And then when people are trying to participate, to minimize the amount of friction and the amount of external cost necessary for them to be able to join a game, know when their match is going to be, play in that match, have the results actually output, and then find their next opponent so that they want to do it again.
Okay. I actually have a lot of questions that kind of lead into that. Like, for instance, now I'm a little bit ignorant on exactly what the free-to-play aspect of Stormgate is. Like, is anyone allowed to just like download it and play tournaments and ladder and stuff like that? Like, is that all free stuff?
That's the intention. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, here's the thing, right? Because in StarCraft 2, I think they did the right thing with having one account, and a lot of people, including me, complained about it. But in StarCraft 1 right now, we have this gigantic problem where every account that you own that you have purchased for $15 or whatever, you literally have 15 accounts that can be deleted and remade instantly, right? Which it causes like a big, like the ladder right now is a cesspool in StarCraft 1. There's literally, I have seen an ASL champion tank his MMR down on an account that doesn't matter because he has 15, like 1,500 points, and bash people. It's like, this is insanity, right? So I just, how is there some way to combat this? Because I've seen a lot of people post on like the StarCraft Brood War Reddit and stuff like this about, it's like, oh my God, all I do is play Smurfs at like such a low MMR, such a low value. And I could imagine if there's tournaments down there as well, things could get bad with people just jumping in and ruining other people's times just to make themselves feel good about bashing a noob or something. So I don't know if you have an answer to that, but that's definitely something that I would be concerned about for lower ranked players, knowing the scum of humanity from Brood War.
Fair. It's certainly a conversation that we're going to be continue to have for a long period of time. And where we feel like the answer for now is going to be is finding the right reward structure that doesn't incentivize that behavior, so that the participation in a tournament is really the main goal, and what we're trying to pull people in. And then the experience should be, if you're having fair competition, if you're having a match against an opponent that feels like you, that's where the true value is for what you're trying to focus on at this casual competition. So if someone smurfs their way down and just crushes their opponents, like, why? Like, what are they getting out of it? And the less that is incentivized, hopefully the more percentage of games that are good quality and are exciting and are rewarding for even the players that lose. So that's kind of where we want to focus the start of our conversation, but it's going to be an ongoing one as it gets out into the wild and players are actually participating, and we see how people are engaging with the tools. So yeah, definitely something to keep an eye on, and we'll be continuing to work with the community to find out what's a pain point And if there's something that's super egregious, like we're going to focus on trying to fix that and make it more focused on the positive sides.
Okay. I mean, that's as good an answer as I think can be made for something like that. People will always find ways to abuse different systems. It's just this is what online gaming is, unfortunately.
Yeah, the one other thing that we are exploring, and there's no promise at all that'll actually be out there, but there's also different ways of doing casual competition. You can still do like a premium version of it that has stakes to get involved, and that could be tied to individual accounts. So even less of a motivation for someone to smurf and do those types of things, because the reward that they would get for that premium engagement is much less than a reward they could get at their proper level. So there are other mechanisms that we can look to tie in, but no promises that that's the direction we're going to go.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so to the like kind of something more viewership based for esports, a lot of people like if you can like go into a game client and then watch a match that's going on. Some games allow things like that. But at the same time, that can do things like reduce viewership on a stream, which in and of itself is a very important metric for games. Like, right, this is like marketing. It gets like, for instance, if a content creator is running a tournament or something, they want as many viewers watching through their channel as possible, and the better that viewership is, the more that encourages them to do more content with Stormgate, for instance. Whereas it might be a better user experience to be able to go in the game and watch. I know that you guys have been at a lot of the old summits for StarCraft 2 where it was talked about, like, for instance, Katz was really pushing maybe embedding streams within the game. You know, there's a really wide variety of things that can be done to make esports accessible within the actual game itself. And is there one that you guys are looking more towards? Like, do you want people's streams to get those extra viewership, or do you want just for people to be so into it and so involved that I can literally just log in and no one needs to be commentating. I'm just watching the game itself.
Yeah, there's a lot of really exciting and complicated technical aspects to a lot of what you just mentioned, particularly when you're talking about embedding streams. Like, what stream are you talking about? And in different areas of the world, that answer is going to be different. So I can't say we're leaning one way or the other, but what we really want to focus on as we're designing our programs and our technology to support esports is around making sure that the audience is incentivized, or the players are incentivized, that as the audience grows, like, they're seeing rewards there. So one thing that we're really excited about is tying in a level of revenue share for the seasonal products that we do come out with that can support direct esports involvement. So having a viewer on an in-client stream versus a Twitch stream or YouTube or anything else, like, that is still growth of the community and presumably growth of just the sales of the game overall, which can then lead to more resources to support the activity that you're talking about. So can't answer the technical where are we going to be at launch for those types of things, but we're very much being mindful of how do we make sure the resources are going to grow with the community, and we get those resources in the hands of the folks that are actually making it all happen.
Yeah, that's really interesting because a lot of people point towards the Dota 2 model of the international, right, and the way that the prize pool gets so big, it gets so much coverage, it kind of builds upon itself and everything. And I know that stuff like that was partially done for StarCraft 2, but the numbers were more hidden, I guess, is the cleanest way to say it, because there's definitely pitfalls of that where it's like, oh, if it's not as much as the community expects, dead game, right? That's a fucking meme that we've been putting up for since 2001. Would you be wanting it to be more Dota 2-esque where you're just kind of going out there and be like, yeah, it's going big, and like having that build upon itself? Or is it more of like, we're supporting the community by doing this, but not necessarily telling you how much the war chest is giving over or whatever?
Very much in the direction that we want whatever that growth to be supporting the community at large, not just a winner prize pool or things along those lines. We want it to actually support, like, again, the people that are making this all possible. So we don't have specific breakdowns of how that structure is going to work or how much we're going to be able to be transparent about, but we do have a lot of excitement around making sure that it's going to places that are going to continue to grow it the next season after that and the next year after that as well. It's very much something that we're looking forward to creating in a way that feels really good for the people buying into it as well as the people receiving the benefits from it.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Trying to think if there was anything else esports related that I can dig out of you right now. The thing is, it feels like esports is not even completely fleshed out at this point, even though we've been going for so long, because there's so many different models, and we already talked a little bit about that. But like, even if you look right now, right, there's, I mean, even look at Valorant, right, where it's like, yeah, they have the official broadcast, but then also big streamers can kind of do it, and that adds a lot of numbers to it. Because this has become such a big thing where esports almost as an overall product for the most part doesn't look that good when you're like, okay, there's this huge production that costs this many $100,000 to put on an event, but then at the same time you have this streamer on Twitch that has just as many viewers. That's one person sitting in front of their thing doing the same game. So I just wonder if there's going to be some sort of mesh there, like what Valorant does, where like if Shroud wants to stream a tournament while it's going on, are you going to give him a clean feed and a blessing to do that? Or is that going to dig into the actual model that you want to sell sponsors through or whatever like that?
Yeah, we want to increase the reach as much as possible. And if people are enjoying it in a certain way with a particular streamer's flavor, like we want to be able to support that and amplify it. For us, a lot of it is going to be just making sure that we're telling good stories. Like a lot of esports is about having that exciting thing you can talk about with your friends about this. Hey, this really cool play happened, or this particular player has a really cool like growth into esports, and the fact that they're on the stage is awesome in XYZ ways. That's something that we're going to want to put a lot of our attention into from the creative side and amplify those stories and make sure that they are something that's digestible and shareable and gets people enthused and dream about trying to be in their shoes one day, for example. But we don't want to shut out any other stories that, even if it's just talking to a very small audience or very small community, we want to still support that and enable that and not shut that down in any way. Exactly how we're going to do that balance is something that we'll have to talk a lot more about. And if there is some sort of streamer deal or something along those lines that brings in the resources to create really cool opportunities for the community at large, we're going to take a very mindful approach to looking at those relationships and making sure that they are being fair to everyone involved and getting a lot of feedback from the folks that are going to be affected, so that at least there's a lot of understanding of why we're headed in the certain directions for a particular year. And if things don't work out perfectly initially, like we're really excited about the ability to iterate over time and respond to that feedback and be able to take some chances here and there and then learn from them and grow in future years. So a lot to still be figured out, but that conversation is exactly what needs to happen to do the best we can do in the short term and then learn from that for the long term.
Yeah. I like hearing all the flexibility that you're kind of talking about here, right? Like,
that would be a good tagline for how we're trying to approach esports.
Yeah, because no one has the perfect model as of yet. That's for sure. Like I look at it and I see stuff wrong with every single approach, and it's good to hear that you're just kind of like, well, we're not exactly sure. We have these ideas kind of in general, and we're gonna work upon that and see if we can make it work out, I guess. I had one more question. I'm trying to think what it was, and it's just completely eluding. It'll come back to me, but I think we're going to jump into some user questions, if that's okay with you guys. For anyone who hasn't posted it yet, there is in the Pylon Show Discord. You guys can throw a question there, and we will ask it. So let's start upon these. Great answers, by the way, guys. It's you've answered pretty much every question I had, and most of them correctly as well. So congratulations on that. All right. Let's go ahead and jump through these first. And some of these might be questions that you guys are not experts in, so that's fine if you just don't really have an answer for it. I specifically asked for you two to be here because these are the portions of games that I like, the competitive game design and the esports aspect. That's all I really care about. But I'm sure there'll be something in here about lore that you guys might not know, which is fine. All right. First question from Tassad. How are you looking to fund esports, and which amounts are you hoping to reach / can we hope for numbers close to StarCraft 2 EPT circuits?
Yeah, I think we covered a little bit of the philosophy. So we do want to have a level of revenue share from products in the game directly to support the esports community at large. We will still also be going out for distribution deals and partnerships with big brands. All of that is very much in the conversation. So that brings a lot of resources into the overall pool that we're able to divvy up to the players and the staff that's making it work. As far as the scale, that's something that I'm going to pull Dan's word here. We're staying very flexible for. We want to make sure that we're scaling esports responsibly with the game. So not looking to set any sort of dollar targets, either low or high, for that. And we're hoping that the community grows really large and we're able to then scale the esports financially in that same aspect. So we're excited to see where it gets to, but we're ready to react and be flexible and build something responsible for the long term.
Thank you to Saad for the question. Up next, we have Polly saying, "Hey ho, how was the process of finding the settings you have chosen, and what gave you the reason to go with that? As a big Doom fan, I am happy to have it now in an RTS. Thanks a lot, and much success in the future." I guess they're probably talking about the actual kind of design, like graphically, that type of thing.
Yeah, the stuff that's behind us.
Yeah.
Kevin, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I can take this one. Thank you for putting that question back up because I almost forgot it. So the process of our setting, I'm definitely not the lore guy, but how we approached, how we decided on our setting was we kind of worked backwards. What is a universe that allows us to tell the stories that we want to tell and specifically allows for the game mechanics that we want in the game? So, for example, that precluded us from doing a more realistic setting. We can't have a setting like, for example, for example, World War II, like in Company of Heroes, where it's very based on like ground play, very based on like there's no spaceships, for example. There's no like crazy lasers or anything, anything that would be unrealistic. I think for Relic, honestly, Company of Heroes is my favorite RTS outside of Blizzard RTSs. I think they do a great job, especially with immersing players into how realistic the game is. Like I really feel like I'm on a battlefield in World War II, but that's not what we're going for, and that's how we ended up with where we at right now in our setting. And I think what's really cool is like we allow for like all the kind of like nerd stuff in our game, right? We allow for the fantasy, we allow for the sci-fi. There's going to be magic, there's going to be technology, and I'm really excited to see like how all those things combine together.
All right, excellent. Thank you for the question, Polly. We have Mitchimus asking, have you guys considered having ranked leagues for different game speed settings? I know you can change the game speed in StarCraft 2, but it hardly matters because all ranked is at fastest. Games like Wipeout allow you to compete for rankings in any speed class, great for new players and experienced alike.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is something, after being a StarCraft 2 dev, this is something we're going to try to actively avoid because it actually, I think it was not only confusing for players, but it was actually very frustrating to deal with as the developer because you have to account for all these different game modes. There are so many instances during design where I was unsure whether the numbers I was putting in were in real time or if you had to divide those times by 1.4. And in addition, it created a lot of problems when you're mixing game difficulties. Like in the co-op mode, for example, you often had players playing at normal and other players playing at hard. And sometimes the matchmaker would put you guys in the same game, and one player would be completely discombobulated because they were unused to playing with that setting. So as much as possible, we're going to try to maintain the same game speeds.
Yeah. I think it's really bad to split anything. Honestly, you gotta keep people together on the same thing. It's like actually, I'm surprised how many people don't realize this. Personally, thank you for the question. Okay, up next we have from Tassad. Would you do patches? Just shake the meta up after some time, or only when something seems imbalanced?
I think we talked about with our constant patch cadence that it's the former rather than the later, with our regular seasonal updates and the expectation that players will know that things will change at very specific points in time.
Okay. Thank you to Saad there for that. And we have from HyperTurtle, you said that new story content will be tied to new seasons and competitive gameplay changes. What are some examples of how this could work? Is the narrative in Fortnite an inspiration for the game telling its own story?
I'm not sure how much Fortnite is an inspiration there, but there's certainly examples in the past that we've kind of looked to of developing stories over time that we're really excited to incorporate into our world. From a competitive standpoint, what we're easily able to look to is when there's a story that's taking place in a new setting. That new setting is going to have different tile sets and other aspects that make it feel very immersive for that particular point of the season. And we're able to then have the competitive maps that are being used in tournaments and on ranked play all kind of reflect that experience. So when you're tuning into a broadcast or a streamer or just looking at the content of the game, it feels very unique and fresh and something that you can have a pretty cool connection to at that particular time. And you can think back of like, oh, that play happened on this map, so it must have been during this season when this cool thing was going on in the story. Just really build that all together and have as many different connections and touch points to strengthen the overall experience and make it feel even cooler. Other interesting ideas have been tossed out there on our Frost Giant Reddit in the past of how we can kind of tie in cool moments in esports into things that might happen in the lore. Can't say or commit to any of those currently, but it's definitely exploring other ways of going deeper in that direction too.
Yeah, I remember, Dan, I don't know if you remember our mutual friend Kayuki from Hearthstone.
Yeah.
He was
I just was thinking of exactly this. I was just going to go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, but basically he was a professional Legends of the Five Rings card game player. And a cool thing that they did in their game was that they actually altered the story based on the esports and like like for example, I actually know nothing about Legends of the Five Rings, but if like my wind deck beat this fire deck, maybe like something in the competitive lore would change in the following season or 2 seasons from now. And maybe, Dan, that's how we pull you into the lore.
Yeah, no, I literally thought of exactly that when Torch was talking about that, about how like you could have 3 stories ready and then like Cyril wins, so now like the demon guys are like winning or something. It's a cool idea. I mean, I'm not actually into lore, but that kind of thing, I'm like, oh, I can get behind that. Like the players kind of having some sort of say there. I like that. Cool. I like that question. Thank you, HyperTurtle. Up next, another HyperTurtle question. With the low skill floor and high skill ceiling, what philosophies will you employ to keep the game fun and balanced for casual players and pros? How might these be applied differently between 1v1 and 3v3?
All right, so this kind of falls...
But yeah, go ahead.
This kind of falls into like just general balance philosophy, and I could literally talk for hours about this, so I'll try to keep it as short as possible. My general thoughts around balance philosophy is the game should be balanced not for 50% win rates in mind, but rather for fun in mind. I think as a balance designer, you are a subset of a game designer. And one of the main like tenets of a game designer, the thing you're trying to maximize is fun overall. However, what that does mean is like the perception of balance is very integral to fun. Like if you're losing, but you perceive that your race is strong, you're going to have generally a better time than if you're losing and you perceive your race is weak. So that's something to factor in as well. So I guess what that means is we're not necessarily balancing so that every race wins the same, but so that players have good feelings all around. If players can have that fun within the game. So I'll give you one example, which is, for example, the traditionally in Terran versus Protoss. In Terran versus Protoss, throughout the history of the game, Terrans felt like they were on a clock to win the game. And even though maybe Terrans actually had the stronger win rates, for example, maybe at one point they had a 50% win rate, I don't think it was particularly fun for them to have that mentality of, I have to win the game, I have to win the game, I have to win the game. And there's a lot of pressure there that makes the game inherently unfun there. So with respect to balancing, I think that's an example of something where maybe the game is balanced, but we would still want to change up the game in some way. With respect to pro play and casual play, what this generally means is the perception of balance is often based around the pro level play, the absolute highest level of play. So as a general rule, the balance changes we would make would be geared towards that highest level of play. However, there are exceptions. There's two exceptions that come up in my mind with regards to StarCraft 2. The first is the addition of High Templar attacks to StarCraft 2. That's something that generally doesn't affect the pro level play almost at all. But something interesting to note is that before it was implemented, Protoss at the lowest levels actually had some of the lowest win rates, which is kind of surprising, right? And this was an example of something that allowed us to implement something that allowed Protoss players at the very lowest level to not run their High Templar into death. So this is an example of something that I think greatly helps the fun aspect for casual players, but doesn't affect pro players. Another example is Widowmine drops, especially in Heart of the Swarm, when at the very pro level, this was not really too much of a problem. For viewers, it was a bit of a problem that in that game somewhat ended early, or can have the potential to end very quickly and very early. But from a balance perspective, I don't think this is a big problem because at the top level, Protoss players can defend it. However, the actual problem in my mind was that it was much easier at the mid-tier levels to execute this strategy rather than to defend it, because as the Terran player, you just put your stuff in a dropship, you move drop the Widow Mines and hope for the best, right? As a Protoss player, you need to have exact warp gate timings, exact stalker warp ins. You need the stalkers to be in the exact right positions, and you need to react as fast as humanly possible. So that was an example where there was a mismatch between the skill that was needed to execute the drop versus the skill that was needed to defend the drop at specifically the tier levels, and that was a large part of the impetus for why Widow Mines were revealed after they detonate in the minds of the designers at the time.
Okay. All right, thank you, HyperTurtle, for the question. Up next, Beomolf asks, LAN functionality has been a contentious topic in the history of StarCraft 2. At one point, Blizzard shipped a local server to competitions around the world to fix the MLG We Want LAN problems, while still maintaining strict server control, a significant break from the Brood War approach. Have you given any thought to LAN functionality in any shape or form? And if so, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, the question about how to make sure that we have fair, high-level competition and professional competition is certainly important to us, and making sure that technology is there to help answer that question and build the world that we're looking for. As far as who has access to that or how it actually enters into the game, I think we're too early to give a true answer to that, but definitely encourage you to ask it again every time that we do these types of things, and then when we have a real answer, we'll be able to provide it.
No problem. Thank you, Bale. Up next, Subsorian. In regards to campaign balance, how will missions be balanced between playing with multiple players versus a solo experience? Will the ability to play those maps cooperatively be woven into the narrative?
Yeah, so I will say that the campaign is one of the things that we're the least developed on in terms of actually building the missions. And I want to take the time to kind of talk about the perception of how difficult it is to build an RTS versus the perception of how difficult it is to build. And I think building campaign maps falls into the territory of most players feel that it's relatively trivial, but it's actually one of the most time-intensive and resource-intensive things to build. It's generally very expensive, and it takes a lot of time. So that's something we're definitely working on. I will say that the design team, in order to prepare to build cooperative campaigns, we've played games such as Red Alert 3, which has featured cooperative campaigns. We've also played community-built custom maps, which are alterations of both the StarCraft 2 and the Warcraft 3 campaigns. There are three-player versions of the StarCraft campaigns in the arcade right now, and there are two-player versions of the Warcraft 3 campaign just on Hive Workshop. And the designers there, they've not only expanded the map to 3 players, but they've added a lot of interesting additions to there as well. So we're taking a lot of inspiration from a lot of the cooperative campaigns that have come before us.
Cool. All right, thank you, Subsorian. Beomolf with another question here. Source 1, Dota 2 had third-party battle passes to support their biggest third-party tournaments. functionality that has since disappeared. What are your thoughts on the feasibility of different third-party integrations to support their events?
That's a very interesting topic for us to continue to explore. Nothing that we can answer today of exactly how it's going to look, but reiterating the philosophy that we had before of the revenue that we're able to bring in for those types of battle passes, whether it's first party or otherwise, is intended to support the entire ecosystem, including third parties. So in that sense, we are still going to make sure there's ways to have third parties get benefits from the scaling growth of the game overall. But as far as whether or not we have a single battle pass for everybody, or if there's carved out ones for supporting specific activity, like that is something we're still exploring.
Okay. I like that question. That's kind of a cool idea I hadn't really thought of. Thank you, Bale. Skywalker112 asks, do we have any information about the lore? Wow, that's a...
Yes.
That's a bit too wide, I think. There's some videos out. But do you guys have anything quick you want to say about that? That's like, damn, Skywalker. Whew.
There's a lot of lore out there.
Yeah. You can definitely check out the videos and stuff, man. There's definitely demons and humans. Okay. Red Gunner Guy asks, how would you incorporate the lore into the units and gameplay? For example, in StarCraft 2, the Zerg idea of spreading creep really does have the feel of this alien swarm covering the world, devouring everything in its path. Will that be a key concern, or will it be to design units and abilities, then write lore into it?
Yeah, so we're actually taking it from two separate approaches. The first is we're taking the lore into account. So what we've done is we've kind of made this this board, and we've described. Number one, we described all these factions. We have descriptors like are they going to be like swarmy, for example? So if I were to do this with let's say the Warcraft races, undead is a lot about like raising the dead. It's a lot about necromancy. Night elf is a lot about day-night mechanics, right? So that is from the lore. We've also taken ideas from different RTS mechanics, such as teleporting or speeding up like building of buildings, for example. And from that direction, we've like have like 100 ideas of RTS mechanics, and we've slotted them into areas in which we feel like make sense to each individual race. So, for example, teleporting might fit on the Infernal faction, for example. That's just an example, not actually what we're doing. But yes, approaching it both from a lore first approach and an RTS mechanic approach.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Red Gunner Guy. Up next from Apoptosis, is there anything you are thinking of implementing to make map control more advantageous for active players? We kind of did answer that a little bit. In StarCraft 2, we see the Watchtowers, but maybe the game has resources on the map that can be claimed, or mercenaries that can be hired to incentivize active play.
Fruitland.
All right. Yeah, we kind of did go over that one. Thank you, though, Apoptosis. Up next, Jin. One of the things that StarCraft and StarCraft 2 did well is the game's ability to run well even on low-end PCs, meaning when you buy a decent gaming rig back in 2010, the game still runs smoothly even after 12 years. Will Stormgate follow the same philosophy?
Yeah, that's something we realize is very important for a lot of regions, specifically the LATAM regions and the CIS regions, which are very popular for RTS. So something we've been communicating to some of those regions about, and something that we're considering when we're building our game. That's all I can say, because I'm not really like a technology kind of guy, but I know we're having those discussions.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you, Jin. Another one from Beowulf says, with respect to the hero discussion, what are your thoughts about how many heroes per faction should be allowed in a game? What are your thoughts on competitive map design random generation, a la AoE, and uncertain spawn locations? You definitely mentioned the uncertain spawn locations, but yeah, is there any idea about random map generation? Like Age of Empires, or how many heroes that you might allow in if heroes are going to become a part of the game?
Yeah, we're still talking about random map generation, specifically in the 3v3 mode. We'll probably try to keep the randomization in 1v1 to a minimum to kind of preserve the Blizzard RTS philosophies around map design. And the second question was around the number of heroes. I think the way that Warcraft 3 does it, with where there's predefined heroes in the taverns, if you do it that way, I think there has to be a limit on the number of heroes, specifically because you have to account for the variety of heroes that your opponent can pick. And you almost always have to pick these heroes at exactly the same time. So often what happens in Warcraft 3 is that two heroes can counter each other, and there's no way you know what hero your opponent is going before you pick your hero. For example, the Demon Hunter beats the Mountain King beats the Warden beats the Archmage, and the Archmage beats the Demon Hunter, something like that. Yeah,
Something like that, yeah.
But yeah, there. So we want to avoid something like if we were to implement heroes in that way, that's something we'd want to avoid. Another alternative is to bring the hero picking process to before the game itself, or perhaps in a team game, especially adding pick ban mechanics. And I think that would kind of minimize the amount of possibilities that you have to take into account when picking your heroes.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Bale. Protoss Strategist asks about the graphic design of the game. Unlike old Blizzard games, did you choose a less gore/realistic design just for the early alpha developing environment purposes, which is probably not definitive, or instead it's mainly definitive for reasons such as performance reasons or to also attract younger players?
Yeah, so I can't speak to the art design myself because I am not an artist at all. But I think one thing we're trying to focus on in terms of art is the readability of the units to ensure that every unit is distinct each other, especially when we add skins to those units. We're trying to stay away from like a Stalker or Mortal situation. And also the backgrounds being more lit, more well lit, brighter, so that it adds to the readability as well.
All right. Thank you, Protoss Strategist. Alexzat says, do you have plans for supporting Apple Silicon, i.e. M1, M2? I have no idea what the fuck this means. If you guys don't, it's fine. But
yeah, it sounds like it's Mac support. I don't know if Kevin or I are technical enough to speak to how that is on the roadmap, but we are very much targeting PC first for getting this game out and getting it to the right state for launch.
All right. Sorry, we don't have more for you on that one. Delphius says, what is the monetization strategy since Stormgate is a free-to-play title?
Yeah, so our monetization strategy is heavily inspired from StarCraft 2's monetization strategy. When we moved the game from a box model to free to play, we were able to double our player base in ways that allowed us to even retain those players over a long period of time. And we think this could have dramatic effects by going free to play in order to grab that player base, in order to make sure the queues are always healthy, in a healthy state. So with regards to specifically the monetization strategy, we're going to try to create content for vast segments of players, including cooperative in the form of skins, in the form of like portraits and other cosmetics, for example, and also in the form of like, say, campaign content and cooperative content. And this will allow players to support the game modes that they interact with, and also like tell us, hey, we want more of this type of content, instead of buying a game from the start and paying for things you don't necessarily want.
Cool. All right, and then we have from Chicken Man, any thoughts on how observing matches will be implemented? StarCraft 2 has lobbies that everyone joins, whereas something like AoE 4 has observing with built-in delay, and you can join the game as an observer at any point.
Yeah. Trevor, do you want to take that?
No, you go for it.
Okay, that's something as a team. I know Ryan, or AKA GameHeart, is very passionate about, is because he's the original creator of the GameHeart interface, which is what StarCraft uses right now. We have talked about things such as being able to drop into the game in the middle of a game itself, I that's probably not a feature we would prioritize for launch. And at the same time, there's a lot of discussion around what is fair in a game of Stormgate. And you can kind of like you can think about it at like what is fair in a game of StarCraft, right? After 2 minutes, can my friends drop into the game and then perhaps like quote unquote stream cheat for me? Like what is like the time frame at which it's considered fair? And I think that really that is different on a game by game basis.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Thank you, Chicken Man. Tonic says, very excited about Stormgate. I've heard the designers talk a lot about Warcraft 3 and StarCraft 2, so I'm wondering where the game will land in terms of army size/supply. Will armies be closer to Warcraft 3 or StarCraft 2? That's a good question. I didn't think to ask that. Okay.
Yeah, so our targeted supply is going to be 200, and so similar to StarCraft, but what we want to aim for is army sizes that are more different from one another. So, for example, the faction that will have the largest number of units will try to aim for numbers that are larger than Zerg, and for our faction that has the fewest number of units, we're going to try to aim for numbers that are perhaps smaller than that of Protoss.
Okay, and so I guess you would probably control that via supply per unit.
Yeah.
But just a quick question: what's going to be the highest supply unit? Do you have an idea of that already? Because I played an RTS a couple weeks ago where its highest supply unit was like 20 supply or something. I couldn't believe how quick I maxed out on that unit. I was like, "What? I only have like 6 of these."
I think in Grey Goo the highest supply unit is like half your max supply, right?
Oh my god. Oh my god. Yeah. Do you have an idea in line with how high you want to go with that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say we would go any higher than that of a mothership, for instance. So that's the like 8 or at the most 10 we're thinking right now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. I like that. These 20 supply units are insane. Phoenix, that was a great question, Tonic. Thank you. Phoenix asks, with Stormgate aiming to be a social RTS, how are you going to make it a good experience and mitigate bad manner, hate, political chats, etc.?
Yeah.
You want to take that, Kevin?
I'm just when you log into Brood War, man, the fucking chat is just so bad. So bad. I love it. Anyways, yeah. Please go.
Yeah, so with regards to chat, that's something we're constantly thinking about right now. I think our main priority is to make chat not feel lonely, or make the game experience when you get into the lobby not feel lonely. A big problem that StarCraft 2 ran into at launch is, even though it was probably like the most popular an RTS had ever been in any game frame in the 2010s to 2012s, it still felt like a very lonely experience because of how the lobby was designed. Players didn't feel like other players were in the game. So that is our number one priority. How we achieve that is yet to be determined. I think we can't just copy and paste what existed well from StarCraft or even Warcraft 3. Warcraft 3 is actually a great example of a game where it does feel social, but you don't have as many of these toxic chats because they are more segmented chats where there's not like 100 or 200 people in them, and there's therefore less likelihood for toxicity, for instance. But when we're building our game, we can't necessarily look to carbon copy what has been successful in the past, because the landscape of video game communication is ever changing. So, for example, right now, Dan, what are we using to like communicate right now? It's
we're
Discord.
like in multi. We're in
that's true.
We're in a Discord channel, but we're also on some weird webcam website, and
yeah,
I think even a third thing. I don't know, man. Cobra does black magic to make these shows.
Okay, so not the best example, but I was going for is Discord right now, and at least in the West, Discord. It's okay. At least in the West, Discord is kind of like the primary mode for communication in terms of gamers overall. So a question we're actively asking now is like, what do we do in the future when we release the game a few years from now? Like, is it going to be carbon copying those chats, or is it going to be just adding, for example, a Discord link into our game? That's something that we're constantly having conversations about, and something I think that won't get figured out until later down in the line.
All right. And I think we got one more in here from Tonic. My favorite part of Blizzard-style RTS games has always been the world editor and custom games, though many players were turned off from the StarCraft 2 editor because of Blizzard's TOS. What is your design philosophy regarding the Stormgate map editor?
Yeah, that's not something I have an answer towards right now. In fact, it is not something that I am personally in active talks about. But it's something that we're taking very seriously. We recognize that it is important for a lot of content creators to be able to feel ownership for those games. So it's something that we'll talk about at a later time.
Okay. And that does the questions from the Pylon Show people, but we do have a few from Reddit that were handpicked. So just a couple more questions. I'll let you guys go. Sorry, we're running a little bit over here. They're asking if there's going to be any sort of mode similar to Archon mode put in. It wasn't very successful in StarCraft 2, but some people do like that, that close of a game, I guess.
Yeah, one of our goals is to try to minimize the scope as much as possible. I know we have a ton of modes that we're trying to support, so that is not something that we're planning to do, especially at launch.
Okay. And here's one from Samwise303. I love this one. Please, for the love of Jesus, ask them when they will be giving us the next big bundle of information about the game. I absolutely hate how big game studios announce a game and then go radio silent until 2 weeks before release. Even just minor updates every few months would be so refreshing.
Yeah, we very much agree with you, Samwise. So thanks for the question. Kevin and I can't give you an exact date of when to look for more information, but please stay tuned to the Reddit, stay tuned to our Twitters, and the best way to know when those things are going to be coming up is to sign up for our beta and our newsletter, and that's where you'll get a announcement of an announcement, because we love those, of when we'll talk more. But the cadence you're talking about, every few months of new information and having it be something that we can talk more deeply about and keep this conversation going, and also talk about how everyone's feedback is being reflected in our ongoing development. That's something we're very invested in as well, and excited to have that conversation with you guys.
Yeah, and another thing that I can say is even before we announced Stormgate, we've been having Reddit discussions and we've been having these public newsletters going on at about a every 2-month cadence. So there's already been discussions back and forth between the community, and we hope to continue those discussions. But exactly what, that is for our marketing team to decide.
All right, here's one from an amazing username. Fartsucker69_420 asks, C2 decided to intentionally add macro mechanics like Mule's Larva injection, etc., in order to ask more APM of the player to gain a lot of resources in return for doing repetitive tasks at regular intervals. What's your stance on these types of mechanics?
Yeah, so with regards to those mechanics, I think the design philosophy behind Stormgate is more that we still want these kind of mechanics, but at the same time, we don't want mechanics. We still want macro mechanics, but we don't want mechanics that are trivial in terms of whether you do them or not. I think the best example here is the queen injectability. I think maybe when it was initially thought of, when it was initially designed, I think there was more energy. There was thought there would be more energy tension on the queen. There would be more decision of whether I spread the creep or whether I transfuse or whether I inject. But how the meta has turned out right now is that it's a very trivial decision. You make so many queens that you always inject. There's not really like thought put behind it. Yeah. I think creep tumors pre rapid fire discovery was an example of an interesting macro mechanic where there is strategy and there is planning around the direction you spread your creep or how many tumors you put in this direction versus that direction. But after the rapid fire discovery, I think that decision making is more minimized as well. So I guess our core philosophy there is we have macro mechanics, or we want to have macro mechanics, but we want to make it so that it's not trivial as a decision whether you use them, and we want some kind of decision making involved in terms of it's not a binary choice necessarily. Do I use it or not? And more that like, how do I use this ability?
Cool. Okay. And here's one from Poppin' Fresh Zero. How does your team see the balance between map design and unit design in regards to competitive gameplay? A wider breadth of maps can mean more features for unit designs to exploit. What kind of variety in map design are you expecting?
Yeah, so
but yeah.
Yeah, so our design with our philosophy around unit design is really to try to not limit map design as much as possible, such that there is the opportunity for a large variety of maps. And I'm sure like the community will make so many maps and will make so many maps that are completely imbalanced for X strategy or Y strategy, but at least like the option theoretically is out there for these crazy maps to happen and for these very very varied games to happen. I would again I would really love it if someone made Outsider in Stormgate. Just
Totally.
a little hint out there.
Yeah. Here's a really good one from OMG Baden. Will we have a customizable UI, including but not limited to zooming individual controls in and out? Remove unnecessary parts of the UI to clean up the view, integration with visual mods to rearrange how information is presented in the same fashion as WeakAuras or I don't know, I can't, something from World of Warcraft. But yeah, like changing around the UI and or zooming in and out in the game like Supreme Commander or something like that. Like, is there any thoughts behind that?
Yeah, with regards to UI customization, I know that's something Ryan, our lead UX designer, is working on, and I believe that is planned. I don't want to put words in his mouth. I can talk about my own philosophies surrounding Zoom in an RTS game. I think I think in StarCraft, for instance, the zoom is very prescribed. You can't really change it except in an observer interface, right? And I think the problem when you introduce the ability to zoom in and out is that there's the potential for players to optimize the fun out of the game. In that maybe the optimal way to play StarCraft is you zoom it like all the way back.
Yeah.
And in that way, it's kind of like how pro players play on low settings. The game is not very visual. You can't really tell what's going on. The art style is less pronounced, and it's really not a great experience for players. It might be the right way to play, but it's not the most fun way to play. And we want to prevent. We don't necessarily want the ability for players to kind of make that choice for themselves in order to play like Supreme Commander, where you're essentially playing with chess pieces rather than actual like units that have designs that have visual clarity.
Yeah, that's actually that's really interesting, and I think you're kind of right on that. Actually, I just want to throw this out there because it's kind of, I always find it super interesting. The best Protoss player in StarCraft 1 plays in windowed mode on a tiny window in the middle of the screen, which, like, obviously it's the same resolution, but he can see literally everything at once. You don't have to move your eyes around at all, right? It's like he literally sees everything, but obviously it's going to be a little bit harder to micro, but totally weird. Totally, yeah, it's weird the lengths people will go to for those advantages too. Hey, here's a quick one. What is your guys' stance on free units?
Okay, so with regards to free units, I think so. There's 3 free units in StarCraft 2 that a lot of people talk about: the Broodlord, the Infestor, and the Swarm Host. And I think when people talk about free units, they often categorize all 3 units to having the same problem. But I actually think all 3 of them have different problems. So let's take the Broodlord. I think the problem with the Broodlord is not necessarily the fact that it shoots free units, but the fact that it's such an overwhelming counter. It's such an overwhelming air counter to ground units. I think in our game, I think just generally in StarCraft 2 overall, air units are a bit over budgeted in terms of power. You have all these air units they're fighting in the late game. All the battles are focused around these air units, and I think air units versus air unit battles tend to be not super interesting because they ignore terrain. Ground versus ground battles are very interesting. Ground versus air units are very interesting because one respects the terrain, but maybe the weaker air force does not respect that terrain. But air versus air units is something that we don't necessarily want, and the Broodlord itself forces those interactions because it spawns the free units that trip up ground units, and it's such a hard counter. Not only that, because of how slow it is, it's an example of a unit that promotes a death ball. And the more Broodlords you have, the more effective it is. You often have scenarios where, why don't I get a drink?
My wife just bought me a coffee.
Nice. But you often have these scenarios where maybe 4 Broodlords or 2 or 3 Broodlords is actually not that effective, but when you make X number of Broodlords, you're encouraged to make more and more Broodlords, and that's something we want to try to prevent. With Infestors, I think spawning a few infested terrans is actually really interesting. The problem with infested terrans is really when you get to late game scenarios where you're able to kind of break the 200 supply cap, in that you're spawning essentially a 300 supply army in a game that was designed with a 200 army supply cap. And just as a theoretical hypothetical, I think if, for example, infestors were limited to 100 energy and they were only able to spawn 4 infested terrans, then actually we wouldn't have this problem of free units. We wouldn't have people complaining about the infested terrans as much. And I think for the swarm host in particular, it's the problem there is that it's relatively difficult to punish the swarm host. And it's basically when you release the locusts themselves, the swarm hosts can get so far that they are relatively invulnerable to counterattacks. And it also incentivizes very binary play. In the current version of the swarm host, a lot of the way you beat it essentially is that you actually try to all in them before the swarm host can get value out of it, and that's slightly degenerate gameplay, I would say. So in general, I would say it's not really the problem of free units, but each of these individual examples of free units has a different problem, and that's something we're looking into when we're designing our units.
All right. It looks like we had a couple of last-second questions to the Patreon thing, too. These will be the last 2 questions, and we will close it out. Thank you so much, guys. Being able to look back at 2-decade history of competitive RTS, have you learned what makes a unit have a high or infinitely high skill ceiling? Do you plan on expanding both individual skill ceilings and the amount of units with very high skill ceilings? Is this possible or game-breaking?
Can you repeat that?
So he's asking basically about units that have huge skill ceilings. I think this is kind of pointing towards the Mutalisk talk that we had before,
right,
which you kind of answered already, but Nicodemus is a subscriber to the Patreon, so
yeah, got it.
Do you think that's is it possibly game breaking to do things like that, I guess, is the part that we didn't talk about.
Yeah, I think as long as you make it so that this is a lot about decreasing the skill floor as well. As long as you make it so that players are able to complete similar actions if they're a new player with a certain amount of efficiency, I think that makes it so that the lower level players can have somewhat of a similar experience as the high level players. So yeah, minimizing the skill floor or lowering the skill floor without necessarily raising the skill ceiling.
Okay. And one more thing, Lord Philium asks, Artosis mentioned the Century, how it could end a game in a single moment. From an esports standpoint, where does the team stand on catch-up mechanics? 2 Banelings, 1 Widowmine, a single DT, ending the game before a whimper with a whimper instead of a bang, ways the audience doesn't know the winner before 10 minutes before GG.
So 2 ways we're looking at there is number 1, we're looking to decrease the not only the so we're looking to increase the time to kill for units, and are also looking to decrease the volatility of units. With regards to time to kill, there's we're looking to have our units be somewhere as durable as something between what StarCraft 1 has and where Warcraft 3 is. In StarCraft 2 specifically, which I think is the game where, of the 3 games, it's the game that has the lowest time to kill, you can often lose the game very quickly by having your first 3 Marines die because you're not looking at them for any instance. But let's say they are slightly more durable, then you can have the interaction where your Marines are being hit, they're taken to half health, and then you can kind of micro them around or retreat them. And this allows it so, yes, if you're not paying attention, you're still punished. You're still taking a lot of damage, but at the same time, it's not necessarily game ending. And I would say that's kind of our approach to volatility as well. We still want these volatile moments where where a lot of stuff is happening, but not necessarily that you're going to die because of it. And I think a part of that comes with our design. An example of that is from our design philosophy around worker harassment and the diminishing returns of workers. You can still kill maybe like 5 workers as easily in Stormgate, but you're not going to be as punished for losing those 5 workers because of the diminishing returns of the economy.
Yeah, that's like, I think a lot of people don't realize that that's a huge part of what screws up RTS games is the workers dying off and then being too valuable at that point, where it's you literally see one Widowmine go off and you're like, yes, I know how this ends. He's the one Colossus he has out won't be enough, guys. I've seen enough games. It's so yeah,
but you still do your best to hype up that game, Artosis.
I normally matters if I'm tired or not. All right. Guys, this has been a wonderful interview. I'm sorry that we went over a little bit, but there were a lot of great user questions in there. Closing out, any final words from you guys?
No, just thank you so much for having us on and having this conversation. Like we're so excited to be able to build this for the community and be part of the community. And that's just going to continue as we get closer to beta actually being available and in all your hands. And yeah, just super excited and thankful.
Yeah. And always I have to give my spiel of, you know what you can do to support our game. Number 1, you can go to playstormgate.com where you can sign up for not only the beta, but the newsletter as well. Number 2, you can go to Steam, you can wish list Stormgate on Steam, and that will help us raise the Stormgate in the Steam algorithm and will promote us in the future. And number 3, you can tell all your friends both about Stormgate and to do the same, to magnify the social aspect, the social impact of Stormgate and RTS games in general. Spread the word.
All right, excellent. And guys, thank you again for sitting down with me for so long and answering all my nerdy questions. One thing I do have to say is RTS, specifically StarCraft, but in a more general sense, RTS is like the only thing that I have done with my entire brain for the past like 24 years or so. And to hear the answers from you guys, it's really, it's really comforting because you guys really, really do know what you're talking about. And every single thing I threw at you, you knew exactly what I was talking about. And you had a very intelligent answer to it. So this is something I can't normally say about people that make RTS games. I mean, you brought up Grey Goo before, so you can see how bad RTS can go. And then this one, this sounds amazing. It sounds amazing. So thank you very much for the talk. I'm looking forward to Stormgate even more after this. So cheers to you guys. Yeah, so that does it for Pylon Show. Big thank you to Cobra Venom for putting it on, and everyone for coming by here today. And thank you to the Patreon supporters and everything. It was fun to do another Pylon Show here. That's going to be it for us. I'm going to be going live on my stream right now. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys later.
Shout out to the Pylon Show, the greatest show on the internet.